Wait, I take it off, she whispered through cracked lips, her torn dress barely clinging to bruised shoulders as she collapsed at the rancher's gate. The old man froze. What had those animals done to her? But before he could speak, riders appeared on the horizon, their laughter echoing across the desert like demons claiming their prize. One girl, one rancher, one choice that would burn Red Hollow to the ground. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The sun hung over Red Hollow like a judge's gavel, merciless, absolute, and burning with the kind of heat that turned men cruel and drove the weak into early graves. It was the kind of day when even the buzzards sought shade, when the wind carried nothing but dust and the distant promise of violence. The kind of day when a girl's scream could get lost in the vastness of the desert, swallowed by the indifference of a town that had long ago learned to look the other way. Jonah Whitlock stood on the porch of his ranch house, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching the heat shimmer rise off the cracked earth like ghosts dancing in daylight. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape, 63 years of sun and sorrow etched into every line of his face, every silver strand in his unkempt beard. His eyes, the color of faded denim, had seen too much and forgotten too little. The war had taken his youth. The desert had taken his wife. Time had taken everything else, leaving behind only this 500 acres of scrubland, a herd of stubborn cattle, and a cabin that creaked with loneliness every time the wind blew. He'd been about to head back inside to face another day of the same routine that had defined the last decade of his existence when he saw a figure stumbling across the open plain, moving with the desperate, uneven gait of something hunted. At first he thought it might be a coyote, wounded and disoriented, but as the shape drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a girl, young, maybe 19 or 20, and she was running like the devil himself was on her heels. Jonah set down his cup with deliberate care, his hand moving instinctively to the Winchester rifle that leaned against the porch rail. Old habits. War habits. The kind that kept a man alive when the world turned savage. The girl stumbled, fell to her knees, pushed herself up again. Even from a distance, Jonah could see the torn fabric of her dress, the way she clutched it to her chest with one hand, while the other reached out desperately toward his ranch, as if it were the last sanctuary on earth. Her feet were bare, leaving small patches of blood in the dust with each step. Jesus Christ, Jonah muttered, moving down the porch steps with a speed that belied his age. His boots hit the hard-packed earth, and he was running before he'd made the conscious decision to do so, crossing the distance between them in long, purposeful strides. She saw him coming and tried to move faster, but her body had nothing left to give. She collapsed 20 feet from his gate, hitting the ground hard, dust billowing up around her like a shroud. By the time Jonah reached her, she'd curled into herself, trembling violently, one arm thrown protectively over her head, as if expecting a blow. "Easy now," Jonah said, his voice low and steady as he crouched beside her. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." She flinched at his words, her breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of panic and pain. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd thought. Her lip was split, swollen, and crusted with dried blood. A bruise was already forming along her left cheekbone, dark and angry. Her dress, what remained of it, was torn at the shoulder and down the side, exposing skin that bore the marks of rough hands. Scratches, bruises, the telltale pattern of fingers gripped too tight. Jonah felt something cold and familiar settle in his gut. Rage. The kind that came slow and deliberate, the kind that didn't burn hot, but rather froze everything it touched. "Can you hear me?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the fury building inside him. "You're safe now. Whatever happened, whoever did this, you're safe here." The girl's eyes opened green as spring grass, wide with terror, and something else. Shame. The kind of shame that made Jonah want to find whoever had put that look in her eyes and teach them the true meaning of pain. "Please," she whispered. Her voice cracked and broken. "Please. I need." She tried to sit up, swayed dangerously. Jonah caught her shoulder to steady her, felt her flinch again at the touch. "Take your time," he said. "Whatever you need, I need to take it off," she said, her hands clutching at the torn fabric of her dress with desperate fingers. "I need to. They made me. I can't." Understanding hit Jonah like a physical blow. She wasn't talking about just the dress. She was talking about the violation, the humiliation, the feeling of being marked by violence. He'd seen it before soldiers who'd survived battles but couldn't survive the weight of what had been done to them, who clawed at their own skin trying to shed the memory. "Okay," Jonah said quietly, shrugging out of his work jacket with careful, deliberate movements. "Okay, let's get you inside first. Can you stand?" She nodded, though the movement seemed to cost her. Jonah slipped his jacket around her shoulders, and she pulled it tight, burying her face in the worn canvas, as if the simple act of being covered could somehow undo what had been done. He helped her to her feet, and she leaned against him heavily, her body shaking so hard her teeth chattered, despite the oppressive heat. They made their way slowly toward the cabin, and with each step Jonah found himself remembering another girl, another time. His sister Sarah. 16 years old and full of life until the soldiers came through their farm during the war. They'd taken her while Jonah was out hunting, and by the time he returned, he forced the memory down, buried it where it belonged in the dark places he rarely let himself visit. But the old guilt stirred anyway, whispering its familiar accusations. "You weren't there. You failed her. You were too late." Not this time, he thought grimly. Whatever had happened to this girl, whatever monsters had put their hands on her this time, he wouldn't be too late. The cabin was dim and cool, a mercy after the brutal sun. Jonah guided her to the old leather chair near the cold fireplace, the same chair where his wife used to sit and read in the evenings before the cancer took her. The girl sank into it with a small sound of relief, pulling his jacket tighter around herself. "I'm going to get some water and bandages," Jonah said. "And some clean clothes. You just sit tight." He moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies. A basin of water from the pump, clean rags, the bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, not for drinking, but for cleaning wounds. A spare shirt and pants that had belonged to his nephew before the boy had grown too big for them and left for the city. When he returned to the main room, the girl was exactly where he'd left her, staring at nothing with those wide green eyes. Shock, he recognized. The body's way of protecting itself from truths too terrible to face all at once. "I'm Jonah," he said, kneeling beside the chair and dipping a rag in the water. "Jonah Whitlock. This is my ranch. You're safe here. I give you my word on that. Now I'm going to clean some of these cuts, and it might sting. That okay?" She nodded slowly, and he caught the slight tremor in her jaw, not from pain, but from the effort of holding back tears. He worked gently, dabbing at the cut on her lip, the scrape along her cheekbone. The water in the basin turned pink, then red. With each touch, he felt his anger grow colder, more focused. These weren't defensive wounds. These were the marks of men who'd held her down while she fought. "What's your name?" he asked softly, trying to ground her in the present. "Elara," she whispered. "Elara Kent." The name hit Jonah with recognition. Daniel Kent's daughter. Her eyes found his surprise flickering through the shock. "You knew my father." "Knew of him," Jonah said carefully. "Good man. Ran the general store in town. Honest as they come." He paused. "I heard he passed last month. I'm sorry for your loss." The tears came, then silent and devastating, rolling down her bruised cheeks. They said he owed them money, the mayor's sons. They came to the store with papers, said my father had borrowed from their daddy and never paid it back. But that's a lie. My father never borrowed money from anyone. He was proud of that. He always said debt was chains, and he'd die free. Jonah dipped the rag again, wrung it out. "What happened today, Elara?" She was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting in the fabric of his jacket. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They came this morning. The three of them, Clayton Marcus and Silas Thornton, the mayor's boys, said I had 1 week to come up with $500 or they'd take the store. I told them I didn't have that kind of money, told them the debt wasn't real. Clayton just laughed. He said there were other ways I could pay." Jonah's jaw tightened, but he kept his movements gentle as he cleaned the last of the visible wounds. "I tried to run," Elara continued, her voice breaking. "But they caught me behind the store, dragged me to the old mill on the edge of town. They said no one would hear me scream out there. And they were right. I screamed until my throat was raw and no one came. No one. She stopped, her breath hitching. Jonah could see her fighting to hold herself together, to not shatter completely. They tore my dress, she said finally. Held me down. Clayton said, I should be grateful they were being gentle, that they could do worse if I kept fighting. I tried. I tried so hard to fight them, but they were too strong. All three of them laughing like it was some kind of game. Jonah set down the rag carefully, his hands steady, despite the violence churning in his blood. Did they? No, Alara said, quickly shaking her head. Not all the way. I kneed Clayton between the legs when he got close, and while he was doubled over, I grabbed a piece of wood and swung it at Marcus. It caught him across the face, and he went down. In the confusion, I ran. Just ran. Didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. She looked up at Jonah, then her eyes haunted. They chased me. I could hear them behind me yelling things, terrible things, about what they were going to do when they caught me. I thought they would kill me. So I just kept running. Through town, past the church, out into the desert. Ran until my feet were bleeding and I couldn't breathe. And then I saw your ranch and I thought maybe you thought right, Jonah said firmly. You did exactly right coming here. But they'll come looking for me, Alara said, fear sharp in her voice. They'll know I came this way. And the mayor, everyone in Red Hollow is afraid of the mayor. Even the sheriff does what the Thorntons say. No one will help me. No one will believe me over them. Jonah stood, his joints protesting slightly, and walked to the window. The sun was starting its descent, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold. Beautiful and pitiless. In the distance, he could see dust-rising riders moving fast. They're coming, he said quietly. Alara's breath caught in a sob of pure terror. I can't go back there. Please, I'd rather die than... No one's dying, Jonah interrupted, his voice hard as iron. And no one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go. This is my land, my home, and I'll be damned if I let anyone cross that threshold uninvited. He turned back to her, and something in his face must have conveyed the depth of his conviction, because her desperate panic eased slightly. You don't understand, she said. The Thorntons, they own this town. The mayor, the sheriff, half the businesses. They can do whatever they want, and no one can stop them. Maybe, Jonah acknowledged, but they don't own me, and they don't own you, not anymore. He moved to the cabinet where he kept his guns, the Winchester, yes, but also his old service revolver, cleaned and oiled despite the years since he'd fired it in anger. He checked the cylinder with practiced ease, loaded it with steady hands. Mr. Whitlock. Jonah, he corrected. And I know what I'm doing, Alara. I've faced down worse than spoiled rich boys playing at being men. They have guns too, she warned, and they won't come alone. I'm counting on it, Jonah said grimly. The dust cloud was closer now, resolving into individual riders, 6 of them. More than Jonah had expected, but not more than he could handle. Probably the 3 Thornton boys and a few hired gunsmen who killed for money rather than conviction. Those were always easier to deal with. Men who fought for pay had a limit to what they'd risk. Men who fought for principle or rage had none. Jonah moved back to Alara, crouched, so he was eye level with her. I need you to listen carefully. There's a loft upstairs, small, but you can hide there. Under the floorboards in the back corner, there's a loose board. If things go bad, you lift that board and drop down into the root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads out to the old barn. You follow that tunnel, you'll come up about 50 yards from the house. There's a horse in the barn. His name is Smoke. He's old, but he's steady. You get on him, you ride east toward the mountains. Don't stop until you reach Fort Collins. You ask for Colonel Marcus Brennan. You tell him Jonah Whitlock sent you, and you tell him what happened. He'll help you. Understand? Alara nodded, her eyes wide. But what about you? I'll be fine, Jonah said, though they both knew it might be a lie. Now go, upstairs, quiet as you can. She stood on shaky legs, started toward the stairs, then stopped and turned back. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Jonah was silent for a moment, thinking of Sarah, thinking of all the times he hadn't been there when it mattered, all the ways he'd failed the people he loved. I had a sister once, he said quietly. She needed help, and I wasn't there. I've spent 20 years wishing I could go back and change that. Can't do that. But maybe I can make sure someone else's sister doesn't have to face monsters alone. Alara's eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was something else mixed with the fear, gratitude fierce and bright. Thank you, she whispered. Thank me when this is over, Jonah said. Now go. She disappeared up the stairs, her footsteps soft on the old wood. Jonah waited until he heard the creak of the loft floorboards, then turned back to the window. The riders were close enough now that he could make out faces. The Thornton boys, as he'd expected Clayton riding in front, tall and arrogant in the saddle, his blonde hair gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Marcus and Silas flanking him, both dark-haired like their mother, both wearing the same expression of entitled cruelty that their father had made famous in Red Hollow. Behind them rode 3 other men. Hired guns, definitely. Jonah recognized the type even at a distance. They sat their horses with the casual confidence of men who'd killed before and expected to kill again. One wore a long duster despite the heat. Another had a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, visible even from here. The third was smaller, wiry, with the quick, nervous movements of a man who relied on speed rather than strength. 6 against 1. Bad odds by any measure. But Jonah had faced worse during the war, and he'd had less reason to fight then than he did now. He stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester cradled in his arms, and waited. The riders came to a halt about 30 feet from the gate, dust settling around their horses' hooves. For a long moment, no one spoke. The desert wind whispered through the scrub brush, carrying the scent of creosote and heated earth. Clayton Thornton dismounted first, his movements slow and deliberate, a man used to others waiting on his pleasure. He was handsome in the way that men of privilege often were, his features regular and his build strong. But there was something rotten behind those blue eyes, something that turned beauty into ugliness. "Evening, Mr. Whitlock," Clayton called out, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone who'd never had to work for anything in his life. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" "Was," Jonah replied flatly. "What brings you out to my property?" Clayton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's a funny question. See, we're looking for something that belongs to us, and we have reason to believe it might have wandered your way." "Nothing of yours here," Jonah said. "Just me and my land." "Now, Mr. Whitlock, I don't think you're being entirely honest with us," Marcus chimed in from horseback. His face bore a fresh bruise across his right cheek. Alara's handiwork, Jonah guessed with grim satisfaction. "We tracked a girl this way. Alara Kent, you know her." "Know of her," Jonah said carefully. "Heard her father died. Shame that." "It is a shame," Clayton agreed, taking a step closer to the gate. "Left the poor girl all alone to deal with his debts. Heavy burden for such a young woman. We've been trying to help her, actually. Offered her several solutions to her problem, but she's proven uncooperative." "Seems to me if a woman says no to your help, you ought to respect that," Jonah said, his voice cold. Silas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Respect. That's rich coming from an old hermit who spends his days talking to cows." Jonah ignored him, his eyes fixed on Clayton. "I'll ask you again, what do you want?" "I want to search your property," Clayton said, his smile fading. "The girl came this way. We can see her tracks leading right to your gate. So either you've seen her or she's hiding somewhere on your land. Either way, we're taking her back to town where she belongs." "Ain't seen anyone," Jonah said. "And even if I had, I wouldn't let you on my property without a warrant." "You got a warrant, Clayton." Clayton's jaw tightened at the use of his first name, a deliberate disrespect that didn't go unnoticed. "Don't need a warrant to retrieve stolen property," Clayton said. "That girl's father owed us money. She inherited that debt, which makes her our concern until it's paid." "Well, that's not how inheritance works, and you know it," Jonah said. "Debts die with the debtor unless there's co-signed documents, and somehow I doubt Daniel Kent was fool enough to put his daughter's name on anything." "Maybe not," Marcus said, his voice harder than Clayton's. "But there are other kinds of debts, the kind that get paid in other ways. The kind that a pretty girl can settle real easy if she's smart about it." The meaning was clear, and Jonah felt his finger tighten slightly on the rifle's trigger. It would be so easy. One shot and Marcus Thornton would never threaten another woman. But that wasn't how this would go. Not yet, anyway. "Think very carefully about your next words," Jonah said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made even the hired guns shift uncomfortably in their saddles. It was the voice of a man who'd killed before and would do so again without hesitation. Because once they're spoken, there's no taking them back. Clayton held up a hand as if to calm the situation. Now let's not get excited here. Nobody wants trouble. We just want the girl. She damaged some of our property when she ran. We need to have a conversation with her about that. About consequences. Consequences, Jonah repeated. That's an interesting word. Let me tell you about consequences, Clayton. You and your brothers come onto my land without permission. That's trespassing. That's a consequence. You try to take someone who's under my protection. That's assault. Another consequence. And if you draw those guns you're all carrying well, that's the kind of consequence that tends to be permanent. The man with the scar leaned forward in his saddle. That's a lot of big talk for one old man standing alone. Who said I was alone? Jonah replied calmly. This rifle's got 15 rounds. I count 6 of you. Now I may be old, but my eyes are still good and my hands don't shake. I can drop 3 of you before you clear leather. Maybe 4 if I'm feeling sharp. Which of you wants to be first? The silence that followed was thick with tension. Jonah could see the calculations happening behind 6 pairs of eyes, weighing risk against reward, courage against cowardice. It was the wiry man who spoke next, his voice surprisingly educated. Mr. Thornton, perhaps we should reconsider our approach here. This man clearly isn't going to cooperate, and I'm not interested in dying for a girl I've never met. The contract I signed was for protection, not warfare. You'll do what you're paid to do, Hayes, Clayton snapped. I'm paid to watch your back in town, Hayes replied evenly. Not to assault fortified positions held by war veterans. There's a difference. Clayton's face flushed red with anger. Fine. We'll go. But this isn't over Whitlock. Not by a long shot. My father's going to hear about this. The sheriff, too. And tomorrow morning we'll be back with the law on our side. Then we'll see how brave you feel. I'll be here, Jonah said simply. And she still won't be going with you. For a moment, Jonah thought Clayton might do something stupid, draw his pistol, charge the gate. But whatever madness burned in the young man's eyes was tempered by self-preservation. He turned abruptly, mounted his horse with more force than necessary. You're making a mistake, old man, Clayton called out as he wheeled his horse around. A mistake you're going to regret. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, Jonah replied. This ain't one of them. He stood on the porch rifle ready and watched them ride away. Watched until they were nothing but dust on the horizon, until the sun had slipped below the edge of the world and the desert was bathed in twilight's purple glow. Only then did he lower the rifle and let out the breath he'd been holding. You can come down now, he called toward the house. There was a moment of silence, then the soft creak of floorboards. Alara appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale in the gathering darkness. They're gone, she asked, her voice small. For now, Jonah said, setting the rifle aside. They'll be back tomorrow, probably with the sheriff, maybe with more men. Alara descended the stairs slowly, clutching his jacket around herself like armor. You should have let them take me. I'm not worth this kind of trouble. That's not for you to decide, Jonah said firmly. And don't let me hear you talk like that again. You're worth standing up for. Every person is. She was crying again, but this time the tears seemed different. Release rather than despair. I don't even know how to thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Jonah replied, moving to light the oil lamps. Warm light filled the cabin, pushing back the shadows. We're a long way from out of this. The Thorntons have power in Red Hollow, money connections. They can make life very difficult if they choose to. So what do we do? Alara asked. Jonah was quiet for a moment, thinking. During the war, he'd learned that the best defense was often a good offense. Wait for your enemy to dictate terms, and you'd already lost. But strike first, strike hard, and suddenly the advantage was yours. Tell me about these papers, he said finally. The ones they claim show your father owed them money. I saw them briefly, Alara said, sinking into the chair again. They looked official, had my father's signature on them, or what looked like his signature. But I know it's fake. My father would never have borrowed from the Thorntons. He hated them, said they were parasites feeding off good people's desperation. Smart man, Jonah said. So if the papers are fake, that's forgery. That's fraud. That's a crime even the Thorntons can't buy their way out of, if we can prove it." "How do we prove it?" Elara asked. "It would be our word against theirs. And who's going to believe us?" "Maybe no one in Red Hollow," Jonah admitted. "But there are other people, federal marshals, judges who don't answer to the Thorntons. We just have to get those papers to the right people." "They're probably in the bank," Elara said. "Mayor Thornton owns it. That's where he keeps all his documents." Jonah smiled grimly. "Then that's where we'll find them." "You're talking about breaking into a bank," Elara said, her eyes wide. "That's illegal," Jonah finished. "Yeah, I know, but sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. Your father understood that. I think he'd approve." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, a summer storm rolling in from the mountains. The air had that electric quality it got before rain, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Get some rest," Jonah said. "You can sleep in my room upstairs. I'll take the chair down here. Tomorrow we start planning. Tomorrow we figure out how to fight back." Elara stood hesitated, then impulsively hugged him. Jonah stiffened in surprise. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with affection that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Then slowly, he put his arms around her, this broken girl who'd stumbled onto his property and awakened something he'd thought long dead. Purpose. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, "for believing me, for protecting me, for everything." "Get some rest," Jonah repeated, his voice gruff with emotion he didn't quite know how to name. She pulled back, nodded, and made her way upstairs. Jonah listened to her footsteps overhead, heard the creak of the bed frame as she lay down. Then silence, broken only by the wind and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. He settled into the chair, the rifle across his lap, and stared into the darkness beyond the windows. Somewhere out there, the Thorntons were plotting, making plans, calling in favors. Tomorrow would bring trouble, he was certain of that. But for the first time in years, Jonah found he didn't mind. Let them come, he thought. Let them bring their threats and their money and their corrupt lawmen. He'd faced worse. And this time he wouldn't fail. Rain began to fall soft at first, then harder, drumming against the roof like fingers tapping out a war rhythm. Jonah closed his eyes and listened to it, and in that sound he heard echoes of another storm, another time when he'd been young and his sister had been alive, and he'd believed the world was something that could be saved. Maybe it still could be. Maybe one wounded girl and one weary man could make a difference. Maybe they could light a fire that would burn corruption to ash and leave something better in its place. Or maybe they'd both die trying. Either way, Jonah thought as sleep began to claim him, it would be a hell of a lot better than sitting alone in this cabin waiting for death to find him in his own time. The storm raged through the night, and in the morning when dawn broke over Red Hollow, it found Jonah Whitlock and Elara Kent sitting at his kitchen table drawing plans by lamplight and speaking in quiet voices about justice, revenge, and redemption. The war for Red Hollow had begun. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds like a promise that couldn't be kept, painting the desert in shades of gold that seemed almost cruel in their beauty. Jonah stood at the window watching the light creep across the land, transforming puddles into mirrors and the wet earth into something that almost looked clean. He'd been awake for hours, his mind turning over plans and contingencies, weighing risks against necessities. Behind him he heard the soft creak of floorboards as Elara descended the stairs. She'd changed into the spare clothes he'd left for her, his nephew's old shirt and pants, both too large for her slight frame, but infinitely better than the torn dress she'd arrived in. Her feet were still bare, bandaged where the desert had shredded them, and she moved with the careful stiffness of someone whose body was a catalog of hurts. "Coffee's on the stove," Jonah said without turning around. "Help yourself." She poured a cup with trembling hands, the ceramic rattling against the pot. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from yesterday's screaming. "Did you sleep at all?" Jonah lied. Truth was, he'd dozed in fits and starts, waking at every sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle each time. Old habits from the war, the kind that saved your life but never quite let you rest. "I dreamed," Elara said quietly, and the weight in those two words told Jonah everything he needed to know about those dreams. She came to stand beside him at the window, cradling the coffee cup, like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "Do you think they'll come today?" Probably, Jonah said. Clayton struck me as the type who doesn't like to be embarrassed. He'll want to show he can't be defied. Question is whether he brings the law or just more guns. Does it matter? Alara asked. The sheriff does whatever the Thorntons tell him to. If they come with badges, it's just the same violence with legal paperwork. She was right, and Jonah knew it. Red Hollow's sheriff, a man named Dalton Reed, had been in the Thorntons' pocket for years. Everyone knew it, but knowing and being able to do something about it were two different things entirely. Then we make sure we're ready for either, Jonah said. He turned from the window and moved to the table where he'd spread out a rough map of Red Hollow drawn from memory in the pre-dawn hours. Come here, I want to show you something. Alara set down her coffee and joined him, her eyes scanning the crude sketch. Jonah had marked key locations: the bank, the sheriff's office, the mayor's house, the old mill where she'd been attacked. This is Red Hollow, Jonah said, tapping the map. Population maybe 300 on a good day. The bank sits here on Main Street right across from the general store, your father's store. The sheriff's office is here 2 doors down. Mayor Thornton's house is on the hill, overlooking everything like he's a king watching over his subjects. I know the town, Alara said softly. I grew up there. I know you did, Jonah replied, but I need you to think about it differently now. Not as home, but as a battlefield. Every building is either cover or exposure. Every person is either an ally or an enemy. If we're going to do this, if we're going to get those forged papers and prove your father's innocence, we need to think like soldiers, not citizens. Alara was quiet for a moment, staring at the map. When she looked up at Jonah, something had changed in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something harder, something that glinted like steel in morning light. Tell me what to do, she said. Before Jonah could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Both of them froze, listening. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace rather than a gallop. Not an attack then, at least not yet. Something more official. Get upstairs, Jonah said quietly. Same place as yesterday. And Alara, no matter what you hear, don't come down until I call for you. Understand? She nodded and disappeared up the stairs. Her movements quick despite her injuries. Jonah waited until he heard the loft door close, then picked up the Winchester and stepped out onto the porch. The riders appeared through the morning haze, 5 of them this time. Sheriff Reed rode in front and his badge catching the sunlight like a warning. Behind him came Clayton and Marcus Thornton, both looking considerably less confident than they had yesterday. The other 2 riders were strangers to Jonah, but their bearing suggested law rather than hired violence. Federal marshals, perhaps, or territorial rangers. Jonah didn't lower the rifle, but he didn't raise it either. He simply stood there, letting them come to him, letting them cross the distance while he held the high ground of his own property. Sheriff Reed dismounted first, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a big man, gone to fat, his face red from sun and whiskey, his eyes small and calculating. Jonah had known men like him in the war, the kind who'd shoot you in the back and then claim they'd been defending themselves. Morning, Jonah, Reed called out, trying for friendly and landing somewhere around nervous. Mind if we have a word? Depends on the word, Jonah replied evenly. You here in an official capacity, Sheriff? I am, Reed said, pulling a folded paper from his vest pocket. Got a warrant here. Judge Thornton signed it last night. Says I can search your property for Alara Kent wanted for assault and theft. Assault and theft, Jonah repeated, his voice flat. That's creative. What's she supposed to have stolen? Property documents, Clayton spoke up from horseback, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Worth considerable money, and she assaulted my brother Marcus when he tried to stop her. Hit him with a piece of wood. You can see the bruise yourself. I can see a bruise, Jonah agreed. Question is how he got it. Man could walk into a door and get a bruise like that, or he could get it defending himself from 3 men trying to rape him in an abandoned mill. The words landed like stones in still water. The 2 strangers and Jonah was now certain they were federal men exchanged glances. One of them, a lean man with a gray mustache and sharp eyes, spoke for the first time. That's quite an accusation, Mr. Whitlock. It's the truth, Jonah said simply. Girl came to my property yesterday running for her life, clothes torn, face bruised, feet bleeding. Said the Thornton boys attacked her at the old mill. Seems to me the only crime here is the one they committed." "That's a goddamn lie," Marcus snarled, but the federal man held up a hand to silence him. "I'm Deputy Marshal Thomas Weaver," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "This is Deputy Marshal James Cole. We're here on other business investigating reports of land fraud in the territory. But if there's been an assault that falls under our jurisdiction too." Jonah felt something shift in the air. The Thorntons felt it too. He could see it in the way Clayton's face paled slightly, in the way Marcus suddenly seemed very interested in his saddle horn. "Now, Mr. Whitlock," Marshal Weaver continued, "if you're sheltering Miss Kent, we need to speak with her, get her statement about what happened. Can't make any judgments without hearing all sides." It was a reasonable request, and Jonah knew it. More than that, it was an opportunity federal marshals weren't beholden to the Thorntons' money or influence. They answered to a higher authority. "She's here," Jonah said, "and she'll talk to you, but not with them present." He nodded toward the Thorntons. "You want her statement, fine, but it'll be given to federal law, not local corruption." Sheriff Reed's face went from red to purple. "Now you listen here, Whitlock." "No, you listen," Marshal Weaver interrupted, his voice sharp. "Mr. Whitlock raises a valid point. If Miss Kent is alleging assault by the Thornton sons, they can't be present during her statement. That's basic procedure. They'll wait outside the property line." "This is outrageous," Clayton protested. "That girl is a liar and a thief. You're taking the word of some hermit over upstanding citizens." "I'm not taking anyone's word yet," Weaver replied coolly. "That's why we gather evidence. Sheriff Reed, you and the Thornton boys will wait by the gate. Deputy Cole and I will speak with Miss Kent. And Mr. Whitlock, if you're amenable, you can be present as well, since she's on your property." It wasn't perfect, but it was better than Jonah had hoped for. He gave a slight nod. "Alara," he called toward the house. "You can come down now. There's federal marshals here who want to hear your story." There was a long pause, then the sound of hesitant footsteps. Alara appeared in the doorway, still wearing the oversized clothes, her bandaged feet, making her look even more vulnerable. When she saw the gathering of men, she went pale and took an instinctive step back. "It's all right," Jonah said gently. "These men are federal law. They're here to listen." Marshal Weaver dismounted and approached the porch slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Miss Kent, I'm Deputy Marshal Thomas Weaver. I understand you've been through something traumatic. I need to hear your account of what happened in your own words. Can you do that?" Alara looked at Jonah, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then she looked at the Thornton brothers, still mounted by the gate, their faces masks of barely concealed fury. Finally, she looked back at the marshal and straightened her spine. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than Jonah expected. "I can do that." What followed was the hardest thing Jonah had watched in years. Alara told her story, halting at first, then with growing confidence as the marshals listened without interruption. She described her father's death, the appearance of the debt papers, the Thorntons' demands. She detailed the attack at the mill, and Jonah watched her hands shake as she recounted being held down, Clayton's weight on her, the tearing of her dress. Marshal Cole took notes with quick, efficient strokes of his pencil. Marshal Weaver's face remained professionally neutral, but Jonah caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the flex of his jaw. The man had daughters, Jonah guessed. This was hitting close to home. "You said you struck Mr. Marcus Thornton with a piece of wood," Weaver said when she finished. "Can you describe that?" "There was a broken beam lying in the mill," Alara said. "When I kneed Clayton, Marcus leaned down to help him. I grabbed the wood and swung it, caught him across the face. Then I ran." "Did you take anything from them? Any papers or documents?" "No," Alara said firmly. "I just ran. I didn't even know which direction I was going. I just knew I had to get away." Weaver nodded slowly, then looked at Jonah. "And she arrived here yesterday afternoon." "Around 3 o'clock, Jonah confirmed. "In the condition I described. I gave her water, cleaned her wounds, offered her shelter. That's when the Thornton boys showed up with hired guns demanding I hand her over." "They had guns?" Cole asked, looking up from his notes. "All 6 of them," Jonah said. "Made threats about coming back with the law. Guess they made good on that, though. I noticed they didn't mention to the sheriff that they'd already been here." Sheriff Reed shifted uncomfortably by the gate. That particular detail had clearly not been shared with the federal men. Marshal Weaver stood brushing dust from his pants. Miss Kent, I'm going to be straight with you. What you've described is serious attempted rape assault, possibly kidnapping, but proving it will be difficult. It's your word against theirs, and they're going to have expensive lawyers and local influence. I know, Alara said quietly. I know no one will believe me. I didn't say that, Weaver corrected. I said proving it will be difficult. But difficult isn't impossible, especially if there's other evidence. You mentioned forged debt papers. My father would never have borrowed money from the Thorntons, Alara said. He hated debt, and he hated them. Those papers have to be fake. If they are, that's fraud, Cole said. Federal crime. We could subpoena the documents, have them examined by experts. Forgery leaves traces, ink analysis, handwriting, comparison paper, aging. If those documents are fake, we can prove it. Hope flickered in Alara's eyes. Really? Really? Weaver confirmed. But it takes time. Weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, the Thorntons will be pushing for your arrest on assault charges. The local law, he glanced meaningfully at Sheriff Reed, may not be inclined to protect you. She's safe here, Jonah said firmly. On my property, under my protection. That's not how the law works, Mr. Whitlock, Weaver said, though his tone suggested he wished it did. If Sheriff Reed has a warrant, that warrant's based on false charges, Jonah interrupted. You know it, I know it, and if you're honest, Sheriff Reed knows it too. Girl defending herself from sexual assault isn't a criminal. She's a survivor. Marshal Weaver was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Jonah and Alara, then toward the gate where the Thorntons waited. Jonah could see the calculation happening behind those sharp eyes, weighing jurisdiction and politics, justice, and practicality. Here's what's going to happen, Weaver said finally. Deputy Cole and I are going to take Miss Kent's statement back to Denver. We're going to open an investigation into the debt papers and the assault allegations. That investigation will take precedence over local warrants. Sheriff Reed, you'll hold off on any action regarding Miss Kent until federal jurisdiction is determined. Now wait just a minute. Reed started to protest. That's not a request, Sheriff, Weaver said, his voice hardening. That's a direct order from federal authority. You have a problem with it, you can take it up with my supervisor, but I guarantee he'll be a lot less polite about it than I'm being. Reed's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, then he gave a curt nod. By the gate, Clayton looked like he wanted to explode. Marcus just stared at Alara with undisguised hatred. Miss Kent will need to remain available for further questioning, Weaver continued. Mr. Whitlock, I'm trusting you to ensure she doesn't leave the area. She'll be here, Jonah said. Good. Weaver turned to Alara. I meant what I said about this being difficult. The Thorntons have money and influence. They'll fight this. But if those papers are forged, if your father was an honest man, the truth will come out. You just have to hold on until it does. Thank you, Alara said, and the relief in her voice was almost painful to hear. The marshals mounted their horses. As they rode toward the gate, Jonah heard Weaver say something sharp to Clayton, too quiet to make out the words, but clear enough in tone. Clayton's face went rigid, and for a moment Jonah thought the young man might do something stupid. But whatever madness burned in him was tempered by the presence of federal authority. The group departed, dust rising behind them like a curtain falling on the first act of a play. Jonah and Alara stood on the porch and watched them go. Watched until the desert swallowed them whole, and the only sound was the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. What happens now? Alara asked softly. Now we wait, Jonah said. Federal investigations take time, could be weeks before they issue a subpoena for those papers, and the Thorntons aren't going to just sit idle while that happens. You think they'll try something? I think they'll do whatever they have to in order to protect themselves, Jonah said grimly. Men like that, men who've never faced consequences for their actions, they get desperate when the walls start closing in, and desperate men are dangerous men. They went back inside, and Jonah set about making breakfast bacon and eggs and fresh bread he'd baked 2 days ago. Simple food, but good. And Alara ate like she hadn't seen a meal in days. Maybe she hadn't. Grief had a way of stealing your appetite along with everything else. As they ate, Jonah found himself studying her. She was young, yes, but there was something old in her eyes now, the kind of age that came from trauma rather than years. He recognized it because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. The war had done that to him. Yesterday had done it to her. "Your father," Jonah said carefully. "Tell me about him." Alara's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "Why?" "Because I need to know what kind of man I'm helping to vindicate," Jonah said. "And because talking about the dead sometimes helps keep them alive in the ways that matter." She was quiet for so long that Jonah thought she might not answer. Then she took a breath and began to speak. "His name was Daniel Kent. He came to Red Hollow 23 years ago with nothing but a wagon, some supplies, and my mother. They'd met in St. Louis. She was a seamstress. He was a merchant's apprentice. They wanted to build something of their own away from the cities and the crowds, so they came west." Her voice grew softer, more distant, as if she were watching scenes play out in her mind. "They opened the general store when I was 2 years old. My mother died when I was 6. Cholera took half the town that summer. After that, it was just me and my father. He taught me everything: how to read, how to keep books, how to tell the difference between honest customers and those who cheat you if you let them. He said that trust was the foundation of commerce, and commerce was the foundation of civilization. If people couldn't trust each other to keep their word, society would collapse." "Sounds like a wise man," Jonah said. "He was," Alara said, and tears glinted in her eyes. "He was so careful about everything, meticulous. He kept perfect records, every transaction, every penny. He said that honesty was its own protection. If you did everything by the book, no one could accuse you of wrongdoing." "But someone did," Jonah observed. "The Thorntons hated my father," Alara said. "Mayor Thornton wanted to buy the store 5 years ago, offered a good price, too. But my father refused, said he'd built it with his own hands, and he'd die before he let someone like Thornton take it. That was the beginning of the trouble." She took another sip of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "After that, inspections became more frequent. Suddenly, there were problems with our permits, our stock, our building codes, fines for things that had never been issues before. My father fought every one of them, proved they were baseless, but it took time and money, and it wore on him. I think that's what killed him in the end, not the sickness, but the stress, the constant battling just to keep what was his. And then the debt papers appeared," Jonah said. "A week after his funeral," Alar confirmed, her voice hardening. "Clayton and Marcus showed up with papers supposedly signed by my father, promising to pay back a loan of $500 plus interest. But my father never borrowed money. Never. I went through all his records, every ledger, every receipt. There's no evidence of any loan, because there wasn't one." Jonah leaned back in his chair thinking. $500 was a considerable sum, enough to ruin someone, but not enough to seem obviously fraudulent. The Thorntons had been clever about it, and with Daniel Kent dead, unable to defend himself or refute the debt, they'd probably thought it would be easy to pressure Alara into compliance. They hadn't counted on her fighting back, hadn't counted on her running, and they definitely hadn't counted on her finding someone willing to stand with her. "These records your father kept," Jonah said. "Where are they now?" "At the store," Alara said. "Hidden in a false bottom in his desk drawer. He showed me once years ago. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should protect those books. They were proof of his honesty," he said. "Worth more than gold." Jonah's mind began to turn, pieces of a plan falling into place. If we could get those records, we could prove there was no loan. Show the marshals that your father's bookkeeping was meticulous, that every penny was accounted for, and that there's no record of any $500 debt. "But the store is in town," Alara said. "Right on Main Street across from the bank. The Thorntons are probably watching it." "Probably," Jonah agreed. "Which is why we don't go in the front door." Over the next hour, they refined the plan. The general store, like most buildings in Red Hollow, had been built with a cellar necessary for keeping goods cool in the desert heat. And Jonah remembered from his occasional visits to town that the cellars along Main Street were interconnected in places, remnants of an older town that had stood there before fire had destroyed half the buildings in the 1850s. If they could access one of the abandoned cellars, they might be able to move underground to the store without being seen. It was dangerous, possibly foolish, but it was also the only way to get the records they needed without walking straight into a trap. There's an old saloon 3 doors down from your father's store, Jonah said, sketching on his map. Burned down 2 years ago, never rebuilt. The cellar entrance should still be accessible from the alley behind it. If we can get in there, we might be able to work our way to your store's cellar. Might? Alara repeated. That's not very reassuring. Nothing about this is reassuring, Jonah said bluntly. But it's what we've got. The marshals need evidence to build their case. Those books are evidence. We get them, we strengthen your position. We don't. And it's still just your word against the Thorntons. Alara stared at the map, her finger tracing the route they'd have to take. When do we go? Tonight, Jonah said. After dark. Fewer people on the streets, easier to move unseen. Tonight, Alara echoed, and Jonah heard the fear in her voice, but also something else. Determination. The same quality that had kept her fighting in the mill, that had given her the strength to run to survive. Okay, tonight. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Jonah gathered supplies, rope, a lantern, his service revolver, a crowbar, for prying open any doors that might be locked or blocked. He cleaned and oiled the weapons with methodical care, each motion bringing back memories of other nights before other battles. Alara watched him work, asking occasional questions. Where had he learned to do this, the war he told her? Which war, the Civil War? He'd fought for the Union 3 years in the infantry, another 2 as a scout. Had he killed people? Yes. Many too many. Did it haunt him every day? She didn't flinch from the answers, and Jonah respected her for that. She was learning what he'd learned long ago, that the world was not kind, that survival sometimes required becoming something harder than you wanted to be. As evening approached, Jonah went out to check the perimeter of his property. He found fresh tracks horses, multiple riders circling the ranch at a distance, watching, waiting. The Thorntons weren't stupid. They knew Alara was here, and they knew the federal marshals had complicated things. They'd be waiting for an opportunity, a moment of weakness. Well, Jonah thought grimly they'd have to wait a long time. He'd survived worse than rich boys playing at power. He'd survived battles where the dead outnumbered the living, where the ground ran red and the air stank of powder and blood. He'd survived the deaths of everyone he'd loved. He could survive this. He returned to the house as the sun began its descent, painting the desert in those impossible colors that made everything look both beautiful and dangerous. Alara had changed back into the torn dress she'd need to look like herself if anyone saw them in town, she explained. She'd covered it with a dark shawl, and in the failing light she looked like a ghost. You don't have to do this, Jonah said one last time. I could go alone, find the records myself. No, Alara said firmly. They're my father's records, my responsibility. And besides, you don't know exactly where they're hidden. I do. We do this together. Jonah nodded, recognizing in her the same stubbornness he'd seen in his sister all those years ago. Some people were born with steel in their spine, and no amount of hardship could bend them. Alara was one of those people. They ate a cold dinner as the last light faded, jerky and hardtack washed down with water. Food meant for traveling, for going to war. Then they waited, watching the darkness deepen, listening to the coyotes begin their nightly chorus. At midnight, Jonah stood and began checking their gear one final time. The revolver sat heavy on his hip. The Winchester rested in the crook of his arm. In his pack, he carried the rope, the crowbar matches, and a small flask of whiskey for medicinal purposes, he told himself, though he knew it was also for courage. Ready? He asked Alara. She nodded, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. Ready. They extinguished the lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness. Jonah's eyes adjusted quickly, another skill from the war, and he led the way out into the night. The moon was a thin crescent offering little light, which was both a blessing and a curse. Harder to see, but also harder to be seen. They moved through the desert like ghosts themselves, Jonah leading and Alara following in his footsteps. The night air was cool, almost cold after the day's heat, and Jonah could feel it burning in his lungs with each breath. Around them, the desert lived rustlings in the brush, the flutter of bat wings, the distant howl of something hunting or being hunted. It took them 2 hours to reach the outskirts of Red Hollow, moving carefully, avoiding the main roads. As they crested a small rise, the town spread out below them, a handful of buildings clustered around a single street, lantern light spilling from windows like promises of warmth and civilization. But Jonah knew better. Civilization was just savagery with better manners, and Red Hollow had precious little of either. They circled wide, approaching from the south where the burned saloon stood. The building was a skeleton now, just charred timbers and memories the cellar entrance marked by a dark opening where the floor had collapsed. Jonah tested the ground carefully before approaching, mindful of weak boards and hidden drops. "There," he whispered, pointing to the cellar opening. "We go down here, work our way north along the old tunnels." Alara peered into the darkness and swallowed hard. "What if the tunnels are collapsed?" "Then we come back up and try another way," Jonah said simply. "But we won't know unless we try." He lit the lantern, keeping the flame low, and descended first. The ladder was old, the rungs rough with rust, but it held his weight. At the bottom he held the lantern high, illuminating a stone-walled cellar that smelled of damp earth and old smoke. "Come on," he called up softly. Alara descended carefully, her bandaged feet making the climb difficult. When she reached the bottom, she stood close to Jonah, her breath quick with fear or excitement, or both. The cellar extended north, just as Jonah remembered the old foundations creating a network of spaces beneath the buildings. They moved through them slowly, carefully, the lantern casting dancing shadows on walls that had stood silent for decades. At the third cellar, they found their way blocked, a cave-in dirt and rocks filling the passage completely. Jonah cursed softly and began looking for another route. There had to be one. The cellars were interconnected, but not in straight lines. They'd have to zigzag, maybe backtrack. "This way," Alara whispered, pointing to a narrow opening partially hidden behind an old barrel. "I think this goes under the alley." She was right. The opening led to a crawl space barely 3 feet high, forcing them to move on hands and knees. The ground was rough, cutting through Jonah's pants, but he pushed forward, the lantern held out ahead of him, Alara following close behind. The crawl space opened into another cellar, this one newer, the walls lined with shelves still holding goods. Canned foods, bottles, sacks of flour gone hard with age. They were under a store, though, which one Jonah couldn't tell. They continued north cellar to cellar until finally Alara gripped Jonah's arm. "Here," she breathed. "This is it. My father's store." The cellar was organized neat, even in abandonment, just like Daniel Kent Jonah thought. Boxes stacked carefully, inventory noted on cards, everything in its place. Even in death, the man's attention to detail remained. "The desk is upstairs," Alara whispered, "in the back office." They found the stairs leading up to the main floor. Jonah tested the door at the top, unlocked, which suggested either carelessness or a trap. He chose to believe carelessness and eased the door open, the Winchester ready. The store was dark, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the front windows. Shapes loomed in the darkness, counters, shelves, the ghosts of commerce. Everything was as Daniel had left it, Alara had told him. The Thorntons hadn't bothered to empty the place yet. They'd been too busy trying to force his daughter into compliance. They moved through the store like shadows, every creak of the floorboards loud as thunder in the silence. The office was in the back, a small room with a desk, a chair, and walls lined with ledgers. Alara went straight to the desk, her hands finding the hidden latch Daniel had shown her years ago. The false bottom opened with a soft click, revealing a leather-bound book. Alara pulled it out with trembling hands, and even in the dim light, Jonah could see tears streaming down her face. "His journal," she whispered. "Every transaction for the last 15 years. Proof that he never borrowed from the Thorntons. Proof that he was honest." "Then let's get it out of here," Jonah said quietly. They retraced their path, moving back through the cellars, through the crawl space, through the dark heart of Red Hollow's hidden foundations. It wasn't until they emerged into the burned saloon, until they breathed the cool night air again, that Jonah allowed himself to believe they'd actually done it. But as they made their way back toward the ranch, moving quickly, now Jonah felt the familiar prickle between his shoulder blades, the sensation of being watched. He glanced back, once saw nothing but shadows and moonlight. But the feeling persisted, and Jonah knew better than to ignore instincts honed by years of survival. Someone had seen them, or someone knew where they'd been, and that meant trouble was coming even faster than he'd anticipated. They reached the ranch just before dawn, exhausted but triumphant. Alara clutched the journal to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world, which in many ways it was. Proof evidence, truth written in her father's careful hand. "We did it," she said, her voice cracking with emotion and fatigue. "We actually did it." "We did," Jonah agreed. "Now we just have to keep it safe until the marshals return." But as the sun rose over Red Hollow, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Jonah stood at his window and watched the dust cloud approaching from town. Riders again more this time. At least a dozen, maybe more. And at the front he could make out the unmistakable figure of Mayor Thornton himself, come to end this once and for all. The war for Red Hollow wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. Jonah counted the riders as they approached through the morning haze, 15 in all, more than enough to overwhelm one old rancher and a wounded girl. But numbers had never been everything. He'd learned that lesson at Shiloh, where a handful of determined men had held a position against a regiment for 6 hours before finally being overrun. What mattered wasn't how many guns you had, but how willing you were to use them. "Get the journal," Jonah said quietly to Alara, who stood frozen beside him at the window. "Hide it in the place I showed you yesterday, the root cellar behind the false wall. If things go wrong, that's where the marshals need to look." "What do you mean if things go wrong?" Alara's voice climbed toward panic. "Jonah, there's too many of them. We can't." "We can and we will." Jonah interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "But I need you to trust me. Hide the journal, then get upstairs to the loft, same as before. And Alara?" He caught her arm as she turned to go. "If I tell you to run, you run. You take Smoke and you ride for Fort Collins, like I told you before. No arguments, no looking back. Understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, then disappeared into the back of the house. Jonah heard her footsteps descending to the cellar, the scrape of wood on stone as she moved the false panel. Good. At least Daniel Kent's final testimony would survive even if they didn't. He turned back to the window and studied the approaching riders more carefully. Mayor Thornton rode at the front, a big man with silver hair and a face that had once been handsome before greed and cruelty had warped it into something grotesque. His 3 sons flanked him, along with Sheriff Reed and what looked like every hired gun in 100 miles. Men with hard faces and dead eyes, the kind who'd kill for $20 and sleep sound that night. But it was the man riding beside the mayor who made Jonah's blood run cold. Tall and lean, dressed entirely in black with a face like weathered leather and eyes the color of winter ice. Jonah recognized him from wanted posters that had circulated during the war. Lucas Kane, also known as the Preacher, though there was nothing holy about him. A killer for hire who'd made his reputation burning Union farms and executing prisoners. The kind of man who didn't just kill you, but made sure everyone who loved you watched first. If the Thorntons had brought Kane, they weren't here to arrest Alara or intimidate Jonah. They were here to end this permanently in the most brutal way possible. Jonah checked the Winchester one more time, then the revolver at his hip. 2 guns against 15. The math was simple and unforgiving, but he'd beaten worse odds before. At least that's what he told himself as he stepped out onto the porch and waited for death to arrive at his doorstep. The riders stopped at the gate, a wall of horses and men silhouetted against the rising sun. For a long moment, no one spoke. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of dust and violence yet to come. Mayor Thornton dismounted first, his movements deliberate and unhurried, a man used to the world bending to his will. He was older than his sons by decades, somewhere north of 60, but age had only sharpened his cruelty rather than dulling it. His eyes, when they fixed on Jonah, held the cold calculation of a man tallying the cost of murder and finding it acceptable. "Mr. Whitlock," Thornton said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family. I'm here to collect it." "Don't know what you're talking about," Jonah replied evenly. "Nothing here but me and my land." "Don't insult my intelligence," Thornton said, his tone hardening. "You broke into my son's property last night, the general store on Main Street. You stole documents that are rightfully ours. That's burglary, Mr. Whitlock, a hanging offense." So they had been seen, or someone had noticed the disturbance. Jonah kept his face neutral, refusing to give Thornton the satisfaction of surprise. The general store belonged to Daniel Kent. His daughter is his rightful heir. Anything in that store is hers by law. "The law," Thornton repeated, and laughed, a sound like gravel sliding down a metal chute. "The law is what I say it is in Red Hollow. Always has been. And the law says that girl owes me money. The law says she assaulted my boys. The law says she's a thief and a criminal. And the law says anyone who shelters her is just as guilty. That's not law, Jonah said quietly. That's tyranny. And I've spent my whole life fighting tyrants. Thornton's face darkened. You think you're a hero, old man? You think you can stand against me? I own this town. I own the sheriff, the judge, the bank. I own every business on Main Street and half the ranches in the county. Men who've crossed me have ended up dead or wishing they were. What makes you think you'll be any different? Because I'm not afraid of you, Jonah said simply. I've looked death in the eye 100 times. Faced down men who'd eat you for breakfast and still have room for seconds. You're just a bully in a nice suit, and bullies always fold when someone finally stands up to them. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Lucas Kane spoke for the first time, his voice like a blade being drawn from a sheath. This one's got spine, Kane said, his pale eyes studying Jonah with the detached interest of a scientist examining an insect. War veteran, I'd guess. Union Army, judging by the way he stands. Seen real combat. Killed men before. He tilted his head slightly. You recognize me, don't you, old soldier? I know who you are, Jonah confirmed. Lucas Kane, the preacher. Wanted for war crimes in 6 states. Murder, arson, torture. The fact that Thornton hired you tells me everything I need to know about his intentions. My intentions are simple, Thornton interjected. Give me the girl and the documents you stole, and I'll let you live. You can pack up and leave Red Hollow, start over somewhere else. Refuse, and Mr. Kane here will demonstrate why his reputation is so well earned. She's not yours to take, Jonah said. And those documents prove your son forged a debt to steal an honest man's property. That's fraud, federal crime. The marshals who were here yesterday are building a case. You touch either of us, you'll have federal law crawling over this town like ants on a carcass. The marshals, Thornton said dismissively, they'll find exactly what I want them to find. Evidence can be manufactured, witnesses can be bought or buried. By the time they finish their investigation, the official record will show that Daniel Kent was a debtor and a drunk, and his daughter was a disturbed girl who attacked my sons and then died tragically while resisting arrest. You'd kill her, Jonah said, his voice flat. Murder a girl half your son's size just to cover up your crimes. I'd kill anyone who threatens my family's position, Thornton replied without hesitation. That's what it takes to build power, Mr. Whitlock. That's what men like you never understood. The world belongs to those willing to do whatever is necessary. Mercy is weakness. Compassion is failure. The strong take what they want, and the weak learn to accept it or die trying to resist. Jonah felt something cold settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had moments before battles during the war, when the drums started and you knew that in minutes men would be screaming and bleeding and dying in the mud. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of violence, knowing you were about to step off into the abyss. Last chance, Thornton said. Give me what I want or I'll take it from your corpse. Jonah's hand moved to the Winchester, not raising it but making clear it was ready. You want to try, you're welcome to, but I promise you'll pay a price. Maybe not all of you will die, but some of you will. And I'll make damn sure it's the ones who matter most. His eyes locked with Clayton Thornton's as he said it, saw the young man go pale. For all his cruelty, for all his violence against a defenseless girl, Clayton was a coward at heart. He'd hurt Alara because he knew she couldn't fight back effectively. But facing a man with a gun with combat experience and nothing left to lose, that was a different prospect entirely. Father, Clayton said nervously, maybe we should— Shut up, Thornton snapped. Then to Kane, do what I'm paying you for. Kane's smile was the most terrifying thing Jonah had seen in years. Not cruel, not angry, just empty. The smile of a man who'd killed so often that human life had become meaningless, a thing to be erased as casually as chalk from a board. With pleasure, Kane said, and reached for his gun. What happened next unfolded in the strange stretched time that Jonah remembered from the war, where seconds became hours, and every detail stood out with crystalline clarity. Kane's hand moving toward his holster, fingers spreading. Jonah's own hands rising, the Winchester coming up smooth and practiced. The hired guns behind Kane Reaching for their weapons, a wave of motion rippling through the group. Jonah fired first, the Winchester's crack splitting the morning silence like thunder. The bullet caught Kane high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, his draw ruined. Jonah levered another round and fired again, this time at the nearest hired gun, a man with a scarred face who'd already cleared leather. The man went down hard, his gun firing wild into the dirt. Then all hell broke loose. The hired guns scattered, some diving for cover behind the stone pillars at Jonah's gate, others wheeling their horses around. Bullets tore through the morning air, thudding into the porch posts, shattering windows. Jonah dropped flat, using the porch rail for cover, and kept firing. He'd learned long ago not to aim for center mass at distance, too much chance of a miss. Instead, he aimed for horses and legs, anything that would disrupt and disable. Another horse went down screaming, throwing its rider. A hired gun clutched his thigh and fell from the saddle, his weapon tumbling into the dust. The Thornton boys were already retreating, spurring their horses back toward town, their courage evaporating the moment actual combat began. Sheriff Reed went with them, his face pale with terror. But Mayor Thornton held his ground, his own pistol drawn, now firing at the porch with methodical precision. And Lucas Kane, wounded but far from finished, had found cover behind a water trough and was returning fire with deadly accuracy. A bullet whined past Jonah's ear, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. "Alara!" Jonah shouted toward the house. "Stay down!" He rolled left, came up behind a different section of porch rail, fired 3 quick shots at Kane's position. Wood splinters exploded from the trough, forcing Kane to duck. In that moment, Jonah saw movement from the corner of his eye. One of the hired guns had circled around, was approaching the house from the side. Jonah swung the Winchester around, but his angle was wrong. The man raised his pistol toward the window where Alara was hiding, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot that rang out didn't come from Jonah's rifle. The hired gun jerked backward, a red stain spreading across his chest. He staggered 2 steps, then collapsed. And there, standing in the doorway with Jonah's old service revolver smoking in her hands, was Alara. Her face was white as bone, her hands shaking violently, but her eyes were clear. "Get back inside!" Jonah roared, but Alara was already moving, disappearing back into the house as bullets tore through the space where she'd been standing. The fight settled into a brutal rhythm. Fire lever, fire again. Duck behind cover while return fire splintered wood and shattered glass. Jonah's world narrowed to targets and angles, to the weight of the rifle in his hands and the burning in his lungs. He'd killed 2 men, for certain maybe 3, wounded twice that many, but there were still 6 or 7 guns firing at him and his ammunition was running low. A bullet caught him in the left arm, a hot lance of pain that made him gasp. Not serious through and through, looked like not hitting bone. But it was his first real injury of the fight, and it reminded him that he wasn't invincible. He was bleeding, tired, and outnumbered. This couldn't go on much longer. Then he heard it, the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats. Many horses approaching fast from the east. For a moment his heart sank, thinking Thornton had brought reinforcements. But then he saw the riders crest the rise, saw the glint of federal badges in the morning sun. The marshals. A dozen of them riding hard, drawn by the gunfire that must have echoed for miles across the desert. "Federal law!" Marshal Weaver's voice rang out across the battlefield. "Drop your weapons, all of you." The firing stopped as abruptly as it had begun. In the sudden silence, Jonah could hear his own ragged breathing, the pounding of his heart, the whimpers of wounded men scattered across his property. Slowly, carefully he stood. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood soaking his shirt. The Winchester felt impossibly heavy now that the adrenaline was fading, but he kept it pointed at Kane, who was still crouched behind the water trough, his own shoulder bleeding freely. "Drop the gun, Kane!" Marshal Weaver ordered, his rifle trained on the killer. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." For a long moment, Kane didn't move. His ice-blue eyes fixed on Jonah, and something passed between them, a recognition perhaps, or a promise of future violence. Then Kane let his pistol fall to the dirt and raised his hands. "Smart choice," Weaver said. He gestured to his deputies. "Arrest them all. Kane Thornton, any of these hired guns still breathing, charges are assault, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud." "You can't do this!" Mayor Thornton roared, his face purple with rage. "I'm the mayor of Red Hollow. I have rights." "You had rights," Weaver corrected coldly. "You forfeited them when you hired a war criminal to murder a federal witness. Take him." Two deputies hauled Thornton from his horse none too gently. The mayor struggled, cursing and threatening, promising that he'd have all their jobs, that they'd regret this, that his lawyers would destroy them. But his words were empty now, the bluster of a man who'd finally met a power greater than his own. Jonah lowered the Winchester and sank onto the porch steps, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Pain throbbed in his arm, spreading up to his shoulder and down to his fingertips. He needed to bind the wound, but he couldn't seem to make his hands work properly. "Jonah!" Elara appeared beside him, her face streaked with tears and gunpowder residue. "Oh God, you're hurt. Hold still, let me—" She tore a strip from her dress and began wrapping his arm with surprising competence, her fingers working quickly despite their trembling. The pressure sent fresh waves of pain through him, but it also slowed the bleeding. "You did good," Jonah said softly. "That man you shot, he would have killed you. You saved both our lives." "I killed him," Elara whispered, and Jonah heard the horror in her voice, the dawning realization of what she'd done. "I killed a man." "You defended yourself," Jonah corrected. "There's a difference. And you'll carry it with you, I won't lie about that. Taking a life leaves marks on your soul that never quite heal. But you did what you had to do to survive. That's not murder, that's strength." Marshal Weaver approached, his expression grim but not unsympathetic. "Mr. Whitlock, we heard the gunfire from town. Got here as fast as we could. I'm sorry we didn't arrive sooner." "You arrived when you arrived," Jonah said simply. "Can't ask for more than that." "How many casualties?" Weaver asked, scanning the battlefield. 3 dead, maybe 4, Jonah replied. "Another 5 or 6 wounded. Kane took a bullet to the shoulder. Should live, unfortunately." "He'll stand trial for his war crimes," Weaver said. "And for this, between your testimony and what we've uncovered about the Thorntons' business practices, we've got enough to put the whole family away for decades." "The documents," Elara said, suddenly gripping Jonah's good arm. "The journal. Did they—" "Safe?" Jonah assured her. "Hidden where I told you. We'll give it to the marshals now. Let them see the truth in your father's own handwriting." Deputy Cole approached a leather-bound book in his hands. "Found this in your root cellar, Mr. Whitlock. Miss Kent told me where to look. I've already reviewed the first few pages. This is meticulous bookkeeping, every penny accounted for. And there's absolutely no record of any loan from the Thorntons." "Because there wasn't one," Elara said, her voice stronger now. "My father was an honest man. Everything he owned, he earned. The Thorntons couldn't buy him, so they tried to destroy him. And when that didn't work, they tried to destroy me." "Well, they failed," Weaver said firmly. "And now they'll pay the price. Mr. Whitlock will need your statement, Miss Kent's too, and we'll need to document this crime scene. But I want you to know what you did here today, standing up to corruption and violence that took real courage. Not many men would have made that choice." "Didn't have a choice," Jonah said. "Not really. Sometimes you see something wrong and you either stand against it or you become part of it. I've seen enough evil in my life. Wasn't about to let more of it happen on my land." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The wounded were treated and transported to town under guard. The dead were covered and carried away. Statements were taken, evidence was collected, and slowly the chaos of battle transformed into the ordered process of law. Kane was the last to be led away. His hands shackled, his pale eyes still fixed on Jonah with that unsettling emptiness. As he passed the porch, he spoke for the first time since the shooting stopped. "This isn't over, old man. Prison doors don't hold forever. And when I get out, I'll come back. I'll find you. And I'll make what the Thorntons wanted to do to that girl look like mercy." "Maybe," Jonah replied calmly. "But I'll be waiting, and next time I won't aim for your shoulder." Kane smiled that terrible, empty smile and let himself be led to the waiting wagon. Jonah watched him go and felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just the cold certainty that Kane had meant every word. Some men were born broken, wired wrong, incapable of anything but violence. Kane was one of them. And if he ever got free, he'd make good on his threat. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today they'd won. Bruised, bloodied, but alive. By noon, the last of the marshals had departed, taking their prisoners back to Denver to face federal charges. The ranch was quiet again, save for the wind and the occasional creak of the house settling. Jonah sat on his porch, his arm properly bandaged now by the marshal's surgeon, watching the desert shimmer in the heat. Alara emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Jonah and settled beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. For a long time they didn't speak, just sat together in companionable silence. 2 people who'd been through hell and somehow made it to the other side. "What happens now?" Alara asked finally. "After the trials, after everything is settled, what do I do?" Jonah sipped his coffee, considering. "That's up to you. But if I was going to offer advice, I'd say you rebuild. Your father's store, it's yours by right now that the Thorntons' claims are exposed as fraud. You open it again, you run it the way he taught you. You show Red Hollow that honest people can still thrive, that corruption doesn't always win." "Alone?" Alara asked softly. "Well," Jonah said carefully, "this ranch is bigger than one old man needs, and I could use help with the herd, especially with my arm laid up. And it strikes me that you might benefit from somewhere safe to stay while the legal proceedings play out. So if you wanted to stay here for a while, help out around the place, I wouldn't object." Alara turned to look at him, and Jonah saw tears glinting in her eyes again, but these were different from the tears of fear and pain he'd seen before. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something that might have been hope. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning coolness, transforming the desert back into its familiar furnace. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out hunting. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. Red Hollow would change now. The Thorntons' iron grip had been broken. New leadership would emerge, better leadership, or so Jonah hoped. The town would have a chance to become what it should have been all along, a place where honest people could build honest lives without fear. And if it didn't, well, Jonah thought he'd spent 20 years hiding from the world, pretending he was done fighting, that his war was over. But the last few days had taught him something important. You never really stop being a soldier. You just choose what battles are worth fighting. This battle had been worth it. Alara was safe. Daniel Kent's name was cleared. Justice, real justice, not the corrupted version the Thorntons had peddled, would be served. "Jonah," Alara said quietly, breaking the silence, "when you told me about your sister, about not being there when she needed you, do you think this makes up for it? Even a little?" Jonah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Sarah. Thinking about the farm, the soldiers, the screams he'd been too late to prevent. For 20 years he'd carried that guilt like a stone around his neck, letting it drag him down into isolation and bitterness. "No," he said finally, honestly. "Nothing can make up for failing someone you love. That guilt doesn't go away. But maybe this is how you learn to carry it better. By making sure others don't suffer the same fate. By standing up when it matters. By being the person you wish you'd been the first time." "She'd be proud of you," Alara said. "Your sister. If she could see what you did for me, she'd be proud." Jonah felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for 2 decades. He blinked rapidly, surprised to find his own eyes wet. "Maybe," he managed, "maybe she would." They finished their coffee in silence, and then Alara stood stretched and looked toward the barn. "I should check on Smoke. Make sure he's got water. And there's laundry that needs doing, and dinner to prepare. If I'm going to be ranch help, I should probably start helping." "Your feet," Jonah reminded her. "You should rest." "My feet will heal," Alara replied. "Same as your arm, same as everything else that's broken. We heal, we rebuild, and we keep going. That's what my father taught me. That's what you've shown me these past days." She disappeared into the barn, leaving Jonah alone with his thoughts and his memories. He could hear her talking to Smoke, her voice soft and soothing, and he smiled despite himself. The old horse had always been standoffish, but he seemed to have taken to Alara immediately. Animals knew things about people that humans often missed. As the afternoon wore on, Jonah found himself thinking about the future, not something he'd done in years. Before, the future had been just more of the same lonely days, empty nights waiting for death to remember his address. But now there was possibility. Alara could stay help with the ranch, maybe even reopen her father's store and split her time between town and the property. They could build something together. Not romantic, nothing like that, but a kind of family nonetheless. The kind forged not by blood, but by shared survival and mutual respect. The sun was beginning its descent when Alara returned from the barn, her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled up. She looked different somehow, still fragile in places, still marked by trauma, but beginning to show hints of the strong woman she'd become once the healing was done. "Smoke's all set," she reported. "And I fed the chickens. Found 3 eggs. I'll make us a proper dinner tonight. Nothing fancy, but better than jerky and hardtack." "Sounds perfect," Jonah said. As she headed inside to start cooking, Jonah remained on the porch watching the light change. The desert transformed in the evening hours, the harsh glare softening into something almost gentle. Colors emerged that weren't visible in the brutal midday sun, purples and oranges, deep reds and golds. He thought about the violence of the morning, the men who'd died on his property. He'd carry those deaths with him too, add them to the weight he already bore. But unlike the deaths from the war-faceless enemies killed because officers ordered it, these deaths meant something. They'd been necessary. Evil men doing evil things stopped because no one else would stop them. That was the difference between murder and killing, he supposed. Murder was about power, about taking something that wasn't yours to take. Killing sometimes was about protecting what should never be violated in the first place. Life. Dignity. The right to exist without fear. The smell of cooking drifted out from the cabin, bacon and beans, coffee brewing, bread warming. Simple smells. Homely smells, the kind that made a place feel lived in rather than just occupied. Jonah stood and made his way inside, closing the door behind him against the cooling evening air. Alara worked at the stove with focused concentration, and Jonah settled into his chair to watch her. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of practice of growing up helping her father run a household as well as a business. Daniel Kent had raised her, well taught her to be capable and independent. The Thorntons had tried to break that, but they'd failed. "Table's set," Alara said, carrying plates over. "It's not much, but—" "It's plenty," Jonah interrupted. "More than I usually have. Thank you." They ate together as darkness fell outside, talking quietly about practical things. The ranch needed repairs, fencing that needed mending, a section of roof that leaked. The store in town would need cleaning, inventory, reopening preparations. Life's mundane details, the kind that grounded you after trauma, reminded you that the world consisted of more than violence and fear. After dinner, Alara insisted on cleaning up, despite Jonah's protest that she should rest. "You're injured worse than I am," she pointed out. "And besides, I need to do something, need to feel useful, need to—" She trailed off, struggling for words. "Need to prove you're more than what happened to you," Jonah finished for her. "I understand that. But Alara, listen to me. What the Thorntons did, what they tried to do, that doesn't define you. You're not a victim. You're a survivor. There's a difference." "Am I?" she asked, and her voice cracked. "Because right now I feel like I'm made of broken pieces, held together with spit and hope. I killed a man today, Jonah. I pointed a gun at another human being and pulled the trigger. And the worst part is I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry at all. What does that make me?" Jonah stood and crossed to her, put his good hand on her shoulder. "It makes you human. Makes you someone who chose life over death, who refused to be a victim. You think I'm sorry for the men I killed this morning? I'm not. They came here with murder in their hearts. They would have killed us both without hesitation. You did what you had to do. Never apologize for survival." She turned into his shoulder and wept, then great shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. Jonah held her awkwardly, with his good arm letting her cry, understanding that this was necessary. The adrenaline had faded. The immediate danger had passed, and now came the reckoning, the moment when the mind caught up to the body and processed the full weight of trauma. He'd had moments like this after the war, times when the reality of what he'd seen and done came crashing down like a tidal wave threatening to drown him. Sometimes the only way through was to let yourself feel it, all of it, without trying to be strong or brave or anything other than honest. Eventually her crying subsided into hiccups, then into silence. She pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "Don't apologize for being human," Jonah said firmly. "You've been through hell. You're allowed to feel it." "How do you do it?" Alara asked. "How do you carry all that weight from the war and still get up every morning?" Jonah was quiet, considering the question honestly. Some days I don't know. Some days I wake up and wonder why I'm still here when so many better men died. But then I remember that they didn't die, so I could waste my life hiding from the world. They died hoping we'd build something better. And maybe I can't save the whole world, but I can try to make my little corner of it a bit less terrible. That's enough reason to keep going. Is that why you helped me? Alara asked. To make your corner less terrible must... Partly, Jonah admitted. But also because it was the right thing to do. And because I've learned that sometimes the universe gives you a second chance to get things right. 20 years ago, I failed my sister. Yesterday, you gave me a chance to not fail again. I wasn't about to waste it. Alara nodded, slowly processing this. Then she straightened, took a deep breath, and seemed to gather herself. Then I won't waste my second chance either. The Thorntons tried to destroy me. They failed. And now I'm going to do exactly what you said, rebuild. My father's store, my life, everything. I'm going to show Red Hollow that you can't break people who refuse to stay broken. That's the spirit, Jonah said, and meant it. They finished cleaning the kitchen together, working in comfortable silence. Outside, the night had fully arrived, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the desert after dark. Coyotes called to each other across the distances. An owl hooted from somewhere near the barn. The wind whispered secrets through the sage. As Alara headed upstairs to bed, she paused on the landing and looked back at Jonah. Thank you, she said simply. For everything, for believing me, for protecting me, for being someone I could trust when I thought there was no one left in the world worth trusting. You're welcome, Jonah replied. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we start figuring out what comes next. Alone in the main room, Jonah settled into his chair and stared into the darkness beyond the windows. His arm throbbed steadily, a reminder of the morning's violence. In a few weeks, it would heal, leave maybe another scar to add to the collection he'd accumulated over 6 decades of living. But some scars he knew weren't visible. Some lived deep inside in places where bandages couldn't reach. Alara would carry scars from her ordeal that would never fully heal. The terror, the violation, the loss of innocence, those would mark her forever. But she'd survived them. She'd proven that already. And maybe Jonah thought that was the real victory. Not defeating the Thorntons, not even surviving the gunfight. The real victory was in refusing to let trauma define you and choosing to rebuild rather than surrender and finding the strength to keep going when every instinct screamed at you to give up. That was the lesson the war had taught him, though it had taken 20 years to truly understand it. Survival wasn't about not getting hurt. It was about deciding that the hurt wouldn't be the end of your story, just another chapter in a longer tale. As sleep finally claimed him, slumped in his chair with the rifle across his lap, Jonah dreamed of Sarah for the first time in years. But this time, she wasn't screaming. She was smiling. And when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. You did good, brother. You finally did good. He woke just before dawn, stiff and sore, his arm screaming protest at having spent the night in an awkward position. But for the first time in 20 years, he woke without the crushing weight of guilt that usually greeted him each morning. Maybe he thought redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about building a future that honored it, about making sure that the failures and losses meant something by preventing others from suffering the same fate. If that was true, then yesterday had been the first real step on that path. And if a broken old rancher and a wounded young woman could stand against corruption and violence and win, then maybe, just maybe, there was hope for Red Hollow after all. The sun rose over the desert, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jonah Whitlock looked at that sunrise and felt something other than resignation. He felt ready. The days that followed the gunfight settled into a rhythm that surprised Jonah with its ordinariness. He'd expected repercussions, expected the Thorntons' remaining allies to make trouble, expected Red Hollow to resist the change that federal intervention had forced upon it. But instead, the town seemed to exhale a long, slow release of tension that had been building for years. Alara threw herself into work with an intensity that bordered on desperate. Her feet healed quickly, the bandages coming off after a week, to reveal new pink skin that would toughen with time. She spent her mornings helping Jonah with the ranch, feeding the animals, mending fence, learning to ride Smoke properly, and her afternoons walking into town to assess the damage at her father's store. Jonah accompanied her on that first trip back, his arm still in a sling, but his rifle within easy reach. They rode together on smoke, moving slowly through the desert heat, neither speaking much, but both acutely aware of what this journey meant. Alara was returning to the place where her nightmare had begun, confronting the demons that had tried to destroy her. Red Hollow looked different somehow, though Jonah couldn't quite pinpoint what had changed. Maybe it was the way people met Alara's eyes now instead of looking away. Maybe it was the absence of the Thornton sons whose swaggering presence had dominated the town for so long. Or maybe it was something less tangible, a shift in the air itself, as if the town had finally remembered how to breathe. The general store stood exactly as Daniel Kent had left it. Though dust had settled thick on every surface, and the air inside smelled stale and dead, Alara stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hand resting on the frame, her eyes scanning the familiar space with an expression Jonah couldn't quite read. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said finally. "When I was a child, this place seemed enormous, like it contained the whole world. Now it just looks tired." "Buildings are like people," Jonah observed. "They need purpose to stay alive. This place has been waiting for you to give it purpose again." They spent that first day simply cleaning opening windows to let fresh air chase away the staleness, sweeping floors and wiping counters. Alara worked methodically, almost mechanically, but Jonah noticed the way her hands lingered on certain objects: her father's ledger, his favorite coffee cup, the wooden stool he'd always sat on while working accounts. Each touch was a goodbye and a promise simultaneously. As they worked, townspeople began to appear. First came Mrs. Henderson, the seamstress, who lived 2 doors down. She was a small woman with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen too much hardship to be shocked by anything. "Miss Kent," she said simply, standing in the doorway. "I'm glad to see you well. Your father was a good man. He gave my husband credit when times were hard and never pressed for payment until we could afford it. I wanted you to know that Red Hollow hasn't forgotten his kindness." She left a basket of fresh bread and preserves, then departed before Alara could find words to thank her. But she was only the first. Throughout the afternoon, others came: the blacksmith, the minister's wife, a young couple who ran the livery stable. Each brought small offerings, food candles, even a bottle of whiskey for Jonah. And each shared a story about Daniel Kent's generosity, his fairness, his unshakable integrity. By evening, when Jonah and Alara prepared to ride back to the ranch, the store's counter was laden with gifts, and the air felt less like a tomb and more like the beginning of something new. "They loved him," Alara said as they rode through the gathering dusk. "I knew he was respected, but I didn't realize how many people he'd helped over the years." "Your father understood something most people miss," Jonah said, "that a community is only as strong as its willingness to help each other. He built relationships, not just transactions. That's why people are rallying around you now. They're not just supporting Daniel Kent's daughter, they're protecting what he represented." "No pressure then," Alara said, but there was a hint of humor in her voice, the first Jonah had heard since the attack. The next weeks brought more changes. Marshal Weaver returned twice, bringing updates on the federal case. The evidence was overwhelming: the forged debt papers, witness testimony from townspeople who'd been similarly victimized, financial records showing years of fraudulent practices. The Thornton family empire was collapsing under its own corruption, and the charges kept multiplying. Mayor Thornton had been formally arrested and was awaiting trial in Denver. Clayton and Marcus faced charges of attempted rape and assault. Silas, the youngest, had apparently fled west, though Weaver assured them that warrants had been issued and marshals were pursuing. Lucas Kane was being held without bail, facing not just the charges from the ranch attack, but also decades-old war crimes that had finally caught up with him. "The trial will likely start in 2 months," Weaver told them during his second visit. "You'll both need to testify. It won't be pleasant. Defense attorneys will try to discredit you, question your character, make you seem unreliable. But the evidence is solid. We'll win this." "What about Red Hollow?" Alara asked. "What happens here once the Thorntons are gone? They owned half the businesses in town." "Federal court will appoint administrators to liquidate their holdings," Weaver explained. "Properties will be sold, probably to local buyers. It'll take time, but eventually Red Hollow will belong to its people again, rather than one corrupt family." After he left, Alara was quiet for a long time, staring at the map of town that Jonah had kept from their earlier planning. Finally, she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "The bank," she said. "The Thorntons owned it. When it's sold, someone will buy it. Someone will control the loans and mortgages and credit that keeps this town running. True, Jonah agreed, not sure where she was going. What if it was someone who actually cared about helping people instead of exploiting them? Alara continued. What if the bank was run the way my father ran his store, with fairness and integrity? Jonah studied her carefully. You thinking about buying it? I don't have that kind of money, Alara admitted. But maybe other people do. Maybe if we pooled resources, got enough townspeople to invest, we could create something different. A bank owned by the community for the community. And it was ambitious, possibly crazy, but Jonah found himself nodding. Your father would approve. He believed in cooperative economics. Said that's how the West would be truly won, not through individual conquest, but through collective effort. Will you help me? Alara asked. I don't know anything about banking or finance beyond basic bookkeeping, but you've lived longer, seen more. And people respect you after what you did. What we did, Mom, Jonah corrected. And yes, I'll help. Though I should warn you, my banking knowledge comes mostly from robbing Confederate payroll trains during the war, which isn't exactly relevant experience. Alara smiled a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. I'll take what I can get. The idea took root and grew. Alara began speaking with townspeople, gauging interest, explaining her vision. The response surprised even Jonah. People who'd been afraid to speak against the Thorntons now came forward with stories of exploitation and abuse. Farmers whose land had been stolen through predatory loans. Shopkeepers who'd been forced to sell at unfair prices. Families who'd lost everything to the Thorntons' greed. And they wanted change. They wanted to build something better. Within a month, Alara had commitments from 20 families willing to invest in a cooperative bank. The amounts were small, $10 here, $50 there, but they added up. More importantly, they represented hope, a belief that Red Hollow could be different, could be better. Jonah found himself drawn into the effort despite his usual preference for solitude. He helped Alara draft proposals, organize meetings, navigate the complex legalities of cooperative ownership. It felt strange being part of something larger than himself again. Strange, but not unwelcome. One evening, as they worked late, going over financial projections by lamplight, Alara looked up from the papers and studied Jonah with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Can I ask you something personal? She said. You can ask, Jonah replied. Can't promise I'll answer. Why did you never remarry after your wife died? You must have been lonely all these years. Jonah set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. It was a fair question, though, not one he'd expected. Guilt, mostly, he said finally. Sarah died while I was away at war. Cancer took her slow and painful, and I wasn't there. Couldn't even make it back for the funeral. By the time I got home, she'd been in the ground 6 months. The house was empty, the ranch was falling apart, and I just didn't see the point of trying to build something new when I'd failed so completely to protect what I had. That wasn't your fault, Alara said softly. You were at war. You couldn't have known. Knowing something intellectually and feeling it are different things, Jonah replied. I spent years telling myself I should have been there, that I should have refused to re-enlist, that her life was worth more than any cause. And maybe that's selfish, but it's how I felt. Still feel sometimes. Is that why you helped me? Alara asked. Because you couldn't help your wife or your sister, so you wanted to save someone else. Jonah considered this carefully. Maybe partly, but also because it was right. Because I've lived 63 years and learned that there are only 2 kinds of people in this world, those who stand up when they see injustice and those who look away. I've looked away too many times. I wasn't about to do it again. Alara reached across the table and squeezed his hand, a simple gesture, but one that carried weight. I'm glad you didn't. Look away, I mean. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. I don't know how to repay that. You already are, Jonah said. By refusing to let what happened define you, by fighting back, by building something good out of something terrible. That's the best revenge there is, not destruction, but creation. They returned to their work, but something had shifted between them. A deepening understanding, a recognition that they'd both been shaped by loss and were now choosing to be shaped by hope instead. The summer heat intensified as July arrived, turning Red Hollow into a furnace that tested everyone's endurance. Jonah's arm healed slowly, the wound leaving a puckered scar that ached when storms approached. Alara's feet toughened until she could walk barefoot across hot sand without flinching. They both bore other scars too, the invisible kind that woke you at night, that made sudden noises cause your heart to race, that turned shadows into threats. But they learned to carry them, learned that survival wasn't about not being wounded, but about continuing despite the wounds. The store reopened on a blazing Thursday morning in mid-July. Alara had spent weeks getting everything ready, restocking shelves, updating inventory, repainting the sign that bore her father's name. Jonah helped where he could, though mostly he just provided steady presence and occasional advice. When they opened the doors at dawn, there was already a line of customers waiting. Mrs. Henderson came first, purchasing fabric and thread. The blacksmith bought nails and wire. The minister's wife selected candles and soap. One by one, Red Hollow's citizens came to show their support, to demonstrate that Daniel Kent's legacy lived on in his daughter. By noon, the store was bustling with activity. Alara worked the counter with practiced efficiency, making change and wrapping purchases, her face flushed with exertion and something that looked remarkably like joy. Watching her, Jonah felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, not quite pride, not quite satisfaction, but something in between. Hope, maybe. Or purpose. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Reed appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, looking considerably thinner and older than he had just weeks ago. The federal investigation had cost him his badge, though he had avoided criminal charges by cooperating with the marshals. Now he was just another citizen stripped of the authority he'd abused for so long. The store went quiet when he entered. Everyone knew who he was, what he'd done. Alara's hand moved instinctively toward the space where Jonah knew she kept a small pistol, another change the attack had forced upon her. "Miss Kent," Reed said, his voice hoarse. "I know I got no right to be here, no right to ask anything from you, but I wanted to say something, and I wanted to say it public where folks could hear." Alara waited, her face expressionless. Reed cleared his throat. "I was a coward. I knew what the Thorntons were doing, the fraud, the intimidation, all of it. I knew, and I did nothing. Worse than nothing. I helped them because it was easier than standing up to them. Because I was afraid of losing my position, my salary, my comfortable life." He met Alara's eyes directly. "What they did to you, what they tried to do, I'm partly responsible. I should have protected you, should have protected a lot of people, and I didn't. And I'm sorry, that don't fix nothing, I know. But I wanted you to hear it anyway." The silence that followed was profound. Jonah watched emotions flicker across Alara's face, anger, hurt, consideration. Finally, she spoke. "You're right. It doesn't fix anything. My father is still dead. I'm still carrying scars that will never fully heal, and dozens of other people are still suffering because of the Thorntons' greed and your cowardice." She paused, and Jonah could see her struggling with something. "But I appreciate you saying it. Takes more courage to admit fault than to hide from it. So I accept your apology, Sheriff. Former Sheriff. And I hope you spend the rest of your life proving you meant those words." Reed nodded, blinking rapidly. "I will. I swear I will. Thank you, Miss Kent. You got more grace than I deserve." He left quickly, and the normal bustle of the store gradually resumed. But Jonah noticed several customers looking at Alara with new respect. She'd had every right to publicly humiliate Reed, to shame him the way he'd failed to protect her from shame. Instead, she'd chosen forgiveness without forgetting mercy tempered with justice. Your father taught you well, Jonah thought. You know when to fight and when to offer peace. As evening approached and the last customers departed, Alara locked the door and sagged against it. Exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "First day done," she said. "God, I'm tired." "You did good," Jonah said simply. "Better than good. You showed this town what real strength looks like." "Didn't feel strong," Alara admitted. "Felt terrified. Every time the door opened, part of me expected it to be Clayton or Marcus come to finish what they started." "But you stayed anyway," Jonah pointed out. "Did what needed doing despite the fear. That's the definition of courage, not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." They rode back to the ranch as the sun painted the desert in shades of copper and gold. The heat was finally breaking, a slight breeze offering blessed relief. Jonah found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't for years. The bank project, the town's rebuilding, Alara's growing strength. These were things worth living for, worth fighting for. Maybe he thought redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about building a future that honored those you'd lost by helping those who still lived. The trial date arrived with the kind of inevitability that made Jonah think of approaching storms. Marshal Weaver sent word that they'd need to be in Denver by the 1st of August prepared to testify. The journey would take 3 days by stagecoach, and they'd likely be in the city for a week or more while the proceedings unfolded. Alara closed the store temporarily, leaving Mrs. Henderson in charge of any urgent business. They packed light Jonah had learned during the war to travel with only essentials, and caught the eastbound stage on a Monday morning when the desert was still cool and manageable. The journey was long and uncomfortable, the coach crowded with other passengers, and the road rough enough to rattle teeth loose. But it gave Jonah and Alara time to prepare mentally for what lay ahead. Weaver had warned them repeatedly that defense attorneys would be merciless, would try to paint Alara as a liar and Jonah as a vigilante. They'd need to remain calm, stick to the truth, and trust that justice would prevail. Denver was overwhelming after months in the desert. The noise, the crowds, the sheer press of humanity made Jonah's skin crawl. He'd lost his tolerance for cities during his years of solitude, and being surrounded by thousands of strangers felt like being slowly suffocated. But Alara seemed energized by it. She walked the streets with her head high, taking in the sights with the curiosity of someone who'd spent her whole life in a small town. Jonah stayed close, one hand never far from the pistol under his coat. Cities were dangerous in different ways than the desert, not the honest danger of snakes and heat, but the slippery danger of pickpockets and con men. Marshal Weaver met them at their hotel, a modest establishment that the federal government was paying for. He looked tired, like a man who'd been working too many hours with too little sleep. "Trial starts tomorrow," he told them. "Judge Harrington presiding. He's fair but tough. Won't tolerate any nonsense from either side. The prosecution has been building the case for weeks, and it's solid. But you need to understand the Thorntons have hired the best lawyers money can buy. They'll try every trick in the book to create reasonable doubt." "What do we need to do?" Alara asked. "Tell the truth," Weaver said simply. "Don't embellish, don't exaggerate, just tell exactly what happened. The evidence will do the rest. But I won't lie to you, it's going to be difficult. They'll ask questions designed to confuse you, to make you angry, to trip you up. You need to stay calm, no matter what they say." That night, Jonah barely slept. He lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed, listening to the sounds of the city through thin walls, and thought about tomorrow. He'd faced death before without flinching, but the idea of sitting in a courtroom while lawyers tried to twist his words filled him with a different kind of dread. The courthouse was an imposing building of stone and marble, its architecture meant to convey the weight and majesty of law. Jonah and Alara arrived early, escorted by Marshal Weaver through back corridors to avoid the press of spectators and newspapermen who'd gathered for what promised to be a sensational trial. The courtroom itself was surprisingly plain wooden benches, a judge's bench of dark oak, a witness stand that looked uncomfortably exposed. The jury box sat empty, waiting for the men who would decide the Thorntons' fate, and there at the defense table sat the accused. Mayor Thornton looked older than Jonah remembered, his silver hair thin and his face gaunt. The arrogance was still there in the set of his jaw, but it was tempered now with something that might have been fear. Clayton and Marcus flanked him, both in suits that probably cost more than most Red Hollow families earned in a year. Clayton wouldn't meet Alara's eyes, but Marcus stared at her with undisguised hatred. Lucas Kane sat separately, chains visible beneath the table. His pale eyes found Jonah immediately, and that terrible empty smile flickered across his face, a promise silent but unmistakable. This isn't over. Judge Harrington entered, a stern-faced man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. The bailiff called the court to order, and the trial began. The prosecution opened with a methodical presentation of evidence, financial records showing systematic fraud, testimony from townspeople who'd been victimized, expert analysis of the forged debt papers. They built their case like a mason laying bricks, each piece of evidence stacking on the last until the structure of guilt became undeniable. Then came the witnesses. One by one, people from Red Hollow took the stand and told their stories. The farmer who'd lost his land, the widow whose late husband's debts had mysteriously doubled, the shopkeeper who'd been forced to sell at bankruptcy prices. Each account was similar: pressure, intimidation, exploitation of vulnerable people by those with power and money. And through it all, the Thorntons sat impassive, as if the testimony was about someone else entirely. On the third day, Alara was called to testify. Jonah watched her walk to the witness stand with her spine straight and her chin up and felt a surge of protective fury at what she was about to endure. The prosecution was gentle with her, letting her tell her story in her own words. She described her father's death, the appearance of the debt papers, the Thorntons' demands. Her voice only wavered when she reached the attack at the mill, but she pushed through it, detailing what had happened with clinical precision. Then came the defense's turn, and Jonah's hands clenched into fists as the attorney, a slick man with oiled hair and a voice like honey over poison, began his cross-examination. "Miss Kent, you claim my clients attacked you, but isn't it true that you were alone at the mill?" "No witnesses. I was alone because they dragged me there," Alara replied steadily. "Dragged? That's quite violent imagery. Did you have bruises from this dragging?" "Yes, Mr. Whitlock saw them. So did the federal marshals. Bruises that could have come from anywhere. A fall, perhaps. An accident." "Objection," the prosecutor said. "Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Harrington ruled. "Stick to questions, counselor." The attorney changed tactics. "Miss Kent, you testified that my clients tore your dress. But you also testified that you fought back. Isn't it possible your dress was torn during your own violent resistance?" Jonah saw Alara's jaw tighten, but her voice remained level. "My dress was torn when they tried to force themselves on me, when they held me down, and you've made your allegation clear," the attorney interrupted smoothly. "But allegations aren't facts. What we have are your claims against 3 upstanding young men from a respected family. Men who say you attacked them first, that you've been mentally unstable since your father's death. Men who say you fabricated this entire story to avoid paying legitimate debts." "That's a lie," Alara said, her voice hardening. "Everything they've said is a lie." Is it possible that your grief has confused you, that you've imagined victimization where there was only reasonable collection of debts?" "I know what happened to me," Alara said, and Jonah heard steel in her voice. "I know what they did, and no amount of expensive lawyers or twisted words will change the truth." The attorney smiled as if she'd proven his point about her being emotional and unreliable. But when Jonah looked at the jury, he saw several men nodding approval at her defiance. They recognized truth when they heard it, even when dressed-up lawyers tried to obscure it. The next day, Jonah took the stand. The prosecution walked him through his version of events, finding Alara. The confrontation with the Thornton riders, the gunfight. The defense tried similar tactics, questioning his motives, suggesting he'd acted as a vigilante, implying he and Alara had conspired together. But Jonah had faced worse than clever lawyers. He'd faced bullets and artillery, and the sight of friends dying in mud. Words couldn't shake him. He answered each question calmly, factually, refusing to be drawn into anger or confusion. When asked why he'd helped Alara, he gave the same answer he'd given her weeks ago. "Because it was right. Because I saw someone in need and had the means to help. That's what decent people do." "Even if it meant killing 4 men, the defense attorney pressed. "I defended my property against armed attackers," Jonah replied. "That's legal under territorial law. They came to my ranch with violence in mind. I responded in kind. I'm not proud of taking lives, but I won't apologize for it either. Those men made their choices. They paid the consequences." The trial continued for another week. More witnesses, more evidence, more legal maneuvering. Lucas Kane never testified, his lawyer wisely keeping him off the stand, where his complete lack of remorse would have sealed his fate even faster. Finally, closing arguments arrived. The prosecution summarized their case with devastating clarity, documenting the pattern of fraud, the systematic exploitation, the attempted rape, and subsequent assault. They painted a picture of men who believed themselves above the law, who used wealth and influence to prey on the vulnerable. The defense countered with appeals to reasonable doubt, to the defendants' previously good reputations, to the possibility that witnesses might be mistaken or motivated by greed themselves. But their arguments felt hollow, like trying to build a house on sand. Judge Harrington's instructions to the jury were precise and thorough. They deliberated for 6 hours, returning as evening shadows lengthened across the courtroom. Have you reached a verdict? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and an honest face. He looked at the defendants, then at the judge. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendants Mayor William Thornton, Clayton, Thornton and Marcus Thornton guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of attempted rape, we find Clayton Thornton and Marcus Thornton guilty. On the charge of assault, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, we find all defendants, including Lucas Kane, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Women gasped, men shouted approval, and somewhere in the back, someone started crying. Judge Harrington banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. The Thorntons sat frozen shock evident on their faces. They truly believed their money and influence would save them, that the jury would side with wealth over truth. Now confronted with the reality of accountability, they seemed unable to process it. Sentencing came the following morning. Judge Harrington showed no mercy. The crimes you've committed strike at the heart of civilized society, Chance, he told the defendants. You used positions of trust and power to exploit those weaker than yourselves. You demonstrated not a shred of remorse, not a moment of human decency. William Thornton. I sentence you to 20 years in territorial prison. Clayton and Marcus Thornton, 15 years each. Lucas Kane, for your crimes, including past war crimes, you are sentenced to hang. Kane's expression didn't change, but Clayton and Marcus both paled. Their father simply stared straight ahead, as if refusing to accept reality even now. Outside the courthouse, Alara collapsed against Jonah, her whole body shaking with relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been grief for what she'd lost and could never get back. It's over, she whispered. It's really over. The trial's over, Jonah corrected gently, but the healing's just starting. That takes longer. They stayed in Denver for another 2 days, wrapping up loose ends with Marshal Weaver, speaking with prosecutors about additional cases being built from the evidence uncovered during the investigation. Weaver informed them that the cooperative bank proposal had been approved by federal administrators, and the sale would proceed as planned. Red Hollow's getting a second chance, Weaver said. Don't waste it. We won't, Alara promised. The journey back to Red Hollow felt different from the journey out. Lighter somehow, as if they'd left a weight behind in that Denver courtroom. They talked more easily, laughed at shared jokes, planned the future with genuine optimism. As the stagecoach crested the final rise and Red Hollow came into view, small and dusty and imperfect, Jonah felt something he hadn't expected. He felt like he was coming home, not just to a place, but to a purpose, to a community, to a life that mattered beyond just his own survival. Alara must have sensed his thoughts, because she reached over and squeezed his hand. Thank you, she said simply, for everything, for saving me, for believing in me, for helping me believe in myself again. You saved yourself, Jonah replied. I just gave you a place to stand while you figured out how. The stage rolled into town just as the sun began its descent, painting everything in shades of gold and copper. And there, waiting in front of the general store, was a crowd of townspeople. Mrs. Henderson in front, the blacksmith beside her. Dozens of others behind them. When Alara stepped down from the stage, they erupted in cheers. Someone had strung a banner across the store's front. Welcome home, Miss Kent. Jonah hung back, letting Alara have her moment. She'd earned it. Earned the respect, the gratitude, the recognition of her strength and courage. She was crying and laughing simultaneously, hugging people, accepting their congratulations. And watching her, Jonah finally understood what redemption really meant. It wasn't about erasing the past or making up for failures. It was about choosing every single day to stand for something better, to help when you could, to fight when you must, to build instead of destroy. His sister Sarah was gone, and no amount of good deeds would bring her back. But Alara was alive and thriving and becoming the kind of person who'd make the world better just by being in it, that Jonah thought was enough, more than enough. As darkness fell and the celebration finally wound down, Jonah and Alara rode back to the ranch together. The desert night was cool and clear, stars blazing overhead in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia. What happens now? Alara asked as they approached the cabin. Jonah considered the question. Now we live, he said simply. We run the ranch, we help rebuild the town, we make sure Red Hollow becomes the place it should have been all along. And when new troubles come, because they always do, we face them together. Together, Alara repeated and smiled. I like the sound of that. They unsaddled Smoke and put him in the barn, then stood together on the porch watching the night deepen around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new struggles. But tonight, for the first time in longer than either could remember, they felt at peace. The war for Red Hollow was over. Now came the harder work of building something worth fighting for in the first place, and they were ready. The autumn came to Red Hollow with a gentleness that surprised everyone who'd endured the brutal summer. September brought cooler mornings and evenings that no longer felt like standing too close to a forge, and with the change in weather came a change in the town itself. Subtle, at first, then increasingly undeniable. The cooperative bank opened on the first Monday of October, housed in the building that had once been the Thorntons' private empire. Alara had insisted on being present for the opening, despite Jonah's suggestion that she might want to avoid the place where so much corruption had been centered. But she'd been adamant, her reasoning simple and unassailable. If we're going to change Red Hollow, she'd said, we have to reclaim every space the Thorntons poisoned. We can't build a new future while hiding from the old one. So they'd cleaned the bank together over the course of several weeks, scrubbing away the physical remnants of the Thornton legacy while symbolically cleansing the space of its darker associations. Mrs. Henderson had sewn new curtains. The blacksmith had forged a new sign that read Red Hollow Cooperative Bank in bold letters. And on opening day, 20 families who'd pooled their modest resources stood together as equal owners of an institution designed to serve rather than exploit. Jonah had been elected to the bank's board of directors despite his protests that he knew nothing about finance. You know about honesty, Alara had countered. That's more important than any technical knowledge. We can learn the rest. That first day they processed 7 loans, small amounts to farmers needing seed for next spring's planting, to a young couple wanting to expand their home, to the minister hoping to repair the church roof. Each loan was reviewed by a committee rather than decided by a single person. Each interest rate was set fairly rather than predatorily, and each borrower was treated with dignity rather than condescension. It was slow work, inefficient by the standards of big city banks, but it was honest. And honesty, Jonah had learned, was its own kind of currency. The general store thrived under Ilara's management. She'd expanded the inventory, added new suppliers, and instituted a credit system similar to what her father had used. Generous terms for those struggling, but with clear expectations about repayment. Word spread beyond Red Hollow, and soon people were traveling from neighboring towns to do business with the girl who'd stood up to the Thorntons and won. Jonah found himself spending more time in town than he'd done in years. Partly this was necessity. The bank board met weekly, and there were always decisions to be made, disputes to mediate, plans to refine. But partly it was choice. After decades of isolation, he'd rediscovered the satisfaction of being part of a community, of contributing to something larger than his own survival. He and Alara fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings at the ranch, tending to animals and property maintenance. Afternoons in town, managing the store and bank. Evenings back at the ranch, cooking dinner together and discussing the day's events. They'd become a unit without ever discussing what they were to each other. Not father and daughter, not quite friends. Something in between that defied easy categorization, but felt right nonetheless. The nightmares still came for both of them. Jonah would wake in darkness, his sister's screams echoing in his ears, the old guilt clawing at his chest. Alara would cry out in her sleep, reliving the attack at the mill, waking with tears streaming down her face. But they'd learned to navigate these moments, to ground each other back in the present, to remind one another that the past was done and couldn't hurt them anymore except through memory. October brought news from Denver. Lucas Kane had been hanged for his crimes, dying with the same empty expression he'd worn in life. The Thorntons were serving their sentences in the territorial prison, and rumors suggested they were having difficulty adjusting to a world where money couldn't buy preferential treatment. Silas, the youngest son, had been captured in California and was awaiting extradition. Good riddance, Mrs. Henderson had said when the news spread through town. Maybe now decent folk can finally breathe easy. But Jonah knew better than to assume evil was ever truly vanquished. The Thorntons had been particularly egregious examples, But men like them existed everywhere. Men who believed power entitled them to exploit others who mistook cruelty for strength. The best you could do was create systems and communities strong enough to resist them when they inevitably appeared. In November, Red Hollow elected a new mayor, a farmer named Samuel Briggs, who'd lost his land to the Thorntons years ago and had spent the time since working as a ranch hand to support his family. He was honest to a fault, completely lacking in charisma, and utterly incapable of the kind of manipulation that politics usually required. In other words, he was perfect. His first act as mayor was to dissolve the Old Town Council, which had been stacked with Thornton loyalists, and call for new elections. His second was to hire a new sheriff, a former U.S. Marshal named Catherine Reeves, who'd retired to the territory after 20 years of service. The fact that Red Hollow's new sheriff was a woman shocked some of the more traditional citizens, but Reeves's reputation preceded her. She was fair, fearless, and utterly uninterested in corruption. "About time this town had real law," Alara had said when Reeves was sworn in. No offense to Sheriff Reed, but being sorry doesn't undo decades of cowardice. Jonah had agreed, though privately he thought Reed's public apology had taken more courage than the man had shown in his entire career. Redemption came in many forms, and Reed was at least trying to find his. That had to count for something. As winter approached, bringing with it the sharp cold that desert nights were famous for, Jonah found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't since before the war. He was 63 years old, his body marked by age and injury, his best years objectively behind him. But for the first time in decades, he felt like he had something to live for beyond mere survival. One evening in early December, as snow fell softly outside, a rare occurrence in Red Hollow that turned the desert into something briefly magical, Alara appeared in the doorway of Jonah's room, looking uncertain. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Of course," Jonah said, setting aside the book he'd been reading. "What's on your mind?" Alara settled into the chair across from him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. For a long moment she didn't speak, just stared at the small fire crackling in the hearth. "I've been thinking about the future," she said finally. "About what I want, where I'm going. And I realized I don't know. 6 months ago, my entire life was about surviving the next day, getting through the trial, making sure the Thorntons faced justice. Now that's done, and I'm lost." Jonah nodded, understanding the feeling. Purpose is a strange thing. Sometimes it's clearer during crisis than during peace. When you're fighting for survival, your goals are obvious. When you're building a life, the path gets murkier. "I love running the store," Alara continued, "and I believe in the bank and what we're trying to build. But is that enough? Is that all there is? My father spent his whole life in Red Hollow, working the same store, serving the same customers. It was a good life, I know that. But sometimes I wonder if there's more." "What kind of more?" Jonah asked gently. Alara struggled to articulate it. "Adventure, maybe? Or just newness? I've never been anywhere except Red Hollow and Denver. I've never seen the ocean or the mountains or any of the places my father used to tell me about from his youth. I'm 20 years old and I feel like I've already lived an entire lifetime, like I went from girl to woman in the space of a few terrible hours, and I missed everything in between." Jonah let the silence settle before responding. He understood what she was really asking, not for permission, but for validation, for someone to tell her it was okay to want more than what Red Hollow could offer. "Your father loved this town," Jonah said carefully, "but he loved you more. And if he were here, I think he'd tell you the same thing he told you about everything else, that honesty includes being honest with yourself. If you need to see the world, see it. If you need to leave Red Hollow for a while, leave it. The store will still be here. The town will still be here. And so will I." Tears glinted in Alara's eyes. "I don't want to abandon you. After everything you've done for me, after—" "You're not abandoning anyone," Jonah interrupted firmly. "You're living. That's what you're supposed to do at 20. Travel, explore, make mistakes. Find out who you are when you're not defined by trauma or responsibility. God knows I didn't do enough of that at your age. Went straight from my parents' farm into the war, then from the war into isolation. Never gave myself permission to just exist without purpose or obligation. But the store can be managed by someone else for a while. Mrs. Henderson would probably love the work. Or we could find someone from one of the neighboring towns. Red Hollow survived before you reopened it. It'll survive if you take some time for yourself. Alara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared that if I leave even temporarily, everything will fall apart, that the Thorntons will somehow win after all. The Thorntons already lost, Jonah reminded her. They're in prison. Their empire is dismantled. Red Hollow belongs to its people now, not to one corrupt family. And you know what the best part is? It's not dependent on you. We've built something sustainable, something that'll outlast both of us. That was the whole point. When did you get so wise? Ilara asked, smiling through her tears. Wisdom is just accumulated mistakes with better marketing, Jonah replied. I've made enough mistakes for 3 lifetimes. Stands to reason I'd learn something eventually. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the wind whistle through the eaves. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and beautiful. Finally, Ilara spoke again, her voice thoughtful. If I did go, and I'm not saying I will not, yet, where would you suggest? Jonah considered this. San Francisco, maybe. Big city, lots of opportunity, but also culture and learning. Or back east Boston, New York. See where your father came from, understand the world he left behind to build something new out here. Or hell, go to Europe if you've got the money and the courage. See Paris, London, Rome. All those places people write books about. That sounds expensive, Ilara said practically. The bank's first profitable year will pay dividends to its investors, Jonah pointed out. You're one of those investors, and the store is making good money. You've got resources now. Use them. Would you come with me? Ilara asked suddenly. If I went, would you come? Jonah was surprised by how much he wanted to say yes. The idea of seeing new places, of escaping the desert that had been both prison and refuge for so long, held genuine appeal. But he knew his answer before he'd finished considering the question. No, he said gently. This is my place now. I spent 20 years running from the world, and I'm done running. Red Hollow needs steady hands to keep the bank honest, to make sure what we've built doesn't get corrupted by the next ambitious man who comes along. That's my role now. But you're just starting. You don't need to be tied down yet. You're not a tie, Ilara protested. I'm an old man who's lived his adventures and survived his wars, Jonah finished. And I'm telling you to go live yours, not forever, just for a while. Get it out of your system, then come back and tell me about everything you've seen. I'll be here, I promise. The conversation ended there, but Jonah knew a decision had been made even if Ilara didn't fully realize it yet. She was going to leave at least temporarily, and that was right. That was good. He'd saved her life so she could live it, not so she could spend it feeling obligated to an old rancher who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. Christmas came to Red Hollow with uncharacteristic festivity. The new mayor organized a town celebration, the first in years, that didn't revolve around the Thorntons' ostentatious displays of wealth. Instead, it was simple and genuine, a communal dinner and the church gifts for the children caroling in the street despite the cold. Jonah attended, surprising himself by enjoying the warmth and camaraderie. Ilara gave him a gift that night, a new hat to replace the battered one he'd worn for years. It was well-made, practical, exactly the kind of thing he'd never buy for himself. He gave her a leather-bound journal, empty pages, waiting to be filled with whatever adventures she decided to pursue. For recording your travels, he said. When you're ready. She understood the message beneath the gift. He was giving her permission, giving her blessing, giving her freedom. She hugged him fiercely, and he let himself hold on a bit longer than strictly necessary. The new year arrived with cold clarity. January 1876 was going to be, Jonah sensed, a year of significant change. And he was right. In February, Ilara announced her intention to travel to San Francisco for 3 months. She'd arranged for Mrs. Henderson to manage the store, had ensured the bank board could function without her constant presence, and had booked passage on a stagecoach that would take her west to the coast. 3 months, she told Jonah as they prepared for her departure. Maybe 4. Then I'll come back. This is still home. It'll always be home. I know, Jonah said, and it'll be here waiting, just like I will. The morning she left was cold and clear, the desert sharp-edged and unforgiving in the early light. Jonah rode with her to town, helped load her bags onto the stagecoach, checked twice that she had enough money, and the letters of introduction he'd written to contacts from his army days who'd settled in California. "You be careful," he told her. "San Francisco's not like Red Hollow. Bigger dangers, different kinds of predators." "I'll be fine," Alara assured him. "You taught me how to shoot, how to stand my ground, how to recognize when someone's lying. I'm better prepared than most." "Still," Jonah persisted, "you write. Let me know you're safe." "I will. Every week, I promise." The stagecoach driver called for final boarding. Alara hugged Jonah one last time, then climbed aboard. The coach lurched into motion, and Jonah stood in the street watching it diminish into the distance until it was nothing but dust and memory. He felt the loss acutely. Not the devastating grief of losing someone to death, but the bittersweet ache of watching someone you care about move toward a future you can't share. It was the right thing, he knew that. But right things could still hurt. The weeks that followed were strange. The ranch felt emptier without Alara's presence, the evenings quieter without her voice. But Jonah had spent most of his life alone, and he knew how to occupy solitude productively. He worked the land, tended his herd, and threw himself into bank business with renewed focus. Letters arrived from San Francisco with gratifying regularity. Alara wrote about the city's overwhelming size, the diverse population, the opportunities and dangers existing side by side. She'd found work in a bookstore owned by one of Jonah's old army contacts, was taking evening classes in literature and mathematics, was exploring the city's neighborhoods with cautious enthusiasm. "I think about Red Hollow every day," she wrote in one letter, "about the store, the bank, the people we're trying to help. But I also feel like I'm discovering parts of myself I didn't know existed. Is it possible to miss home while also being grateful to be away from it?" Jonah wrote back, "Not just possible, but necessary. That tension is what keeps us honest, the pull between where we're from and where we're going. Honor both directions, and you'll find your path." Spring arrived, bringing with it the renewal that the desert managed despite its harshness. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors, transforming the landscape briefly into something that rivaled any garden. Jonah found himself appreciating these small miracles more than he had in years, as if Alara's absence had sharpened his awareness of beauty. In April, a telegram arrived that changed everything. Jonah was in town on bank business when Sheriff Reeves found him, her face grim. "Message came through this morning," she said, handing him the yellow paper. "Thought you'd want to see it immediately." Jonah read it twice, his stomach sinking with each word. Lucas Kane escaped during prison transport. Stop, 3 guards dead. Stop, believed heading west. Stop, consider him armed and extremely dangerous. Stop, warn all potential targets. Stop. The paper trembled slightly in Jonah's hands. Kane. He'd known the man's execution seemed too clean, too final. Men like Kane didn't die easy. They slipped through cracks, found opportunities, survived through pure malevolent will. "You think he's coming here?" Sheriff Reeves asked. "I know he is," Jonah said. "He promised he would, and Kane's one thing, if nothing else, a man of his word when it comes to violence." "We'll be ready," Reeves said. "I'll post deputies, organize patrols, make sure—" "Won't matter," Jonah interrupted. "Kane's not interested in Red Hollow or its people. He's interested in me and in Alara. He'll come for both of us." "Miss Kent's in San Francisco," Reeves pointed out. "She's safe there." "Is she?" Jonah asked. "Kane's smart. He'll figure out where she is, and he'll use her to get to me or use me to get to her. Either way, we're both targets." He sent a telegram to San Francisco immediately addressed to Alara, care of the bookstore. Short message. Stop. Kane escaped. Stop. Come home immediately or stay put and wait for instructions. Stop. Do not travel alone. Stop. The reply came 3 hours later. Returning to Red Hollow. Stop, arriving May 1st. Stop, will not hide. Stop. We face this together. Stop. Jonah cursed creatively enough that Sheriff Reeves raised her eyebrows. "She's supposed to be the smart one," he muttered. "What part of extremely dangerous escaped killer sounds like a good reason to come back?" "The part where you're here alone," Reeves said quietly. "She's loyal. Can't fault her for that." "I can when it puts her life in danger." Jonah replied. But he understood her reasoning. They'd survived the Thorntons together. They'd built something meaningful together. Of course she'd come back to face Cain together. It was stupid and brave and exactly what he'd have done at her age. The next 2 weeks crawled past with agonizing slowness. Jonah prepared the ranch for siege, stockpiling ammunition, reinforcing doors and windows, establishing sight lines and defensive positions. Sheriff Reeves posted deputies in town, warned citizens to be vigilant, organized a volunteer watch rotation. But Cain didn't appear. The desert remained quiet, except for wind and wildlife. And as May 1st approached, Jonah found himself torn between hoping Cain would show himself before Alara arrived and praying he wouldn't show at all. Alara's stagecoach pulled into Red Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun was high and merciless. Jonah was waiting in the street rifle slung across his back, eyes constantly scanning for threats. When she stepped down looking older, somehow, despite only 3 months' absence, his relief was almost overwhelming. "You shouldn't have come back," he said by way of greeting. "Hello to you too," Alara replied, but she was smiling. "And yes, I should have. This is home. Cain's my problem as much as yours. We face him together." "Together?" Jonah echoed, and found himself smiling despite the circumstances. "Stubborn woman." "Learned from a stubborn man," Alara countered. They rode back to the ranch together, Alara filling him in on San Francisco's wonders and frustrations, Jonah updating her on Red Hollow's progress. It felt right having her back, like a part of himself that had been temporarily displaced had returned to its proper location. That night they sat on the porch as the sun set, both armed, both watchful. The desert stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and indifferent to human drama. "He's out there somewhere," Alara said quietly. "Watching, planning." "But probably," Jonah agreed. "Cain's patient when he needs to be. He'll wait for the perfect moment, the perfect opportunity." "So what do we do?" "We live," Jonah said simply. "We don't let him turn us into prisoners of fear. We work. We build. We continue what we started. And when he comes, and he will come, we'll be ready." "You sound very calm about facing a man who wants to kill us both." "I'm terrified," Jonah admitted. "But I learned a long time ago that fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. You can be scared and still do what needs doing." They sat in silence until full darkness fell, then went inside and barred the door. Jonah slept in his chair again, rifle across his lap, while Alara took the room upstairs. Both knew that sleep would be fitful at best, that every sound would bring instant wakefulness, that they'd entered a new kind of siege, not the immediate violence of the gunfight with the Thorntons, but the slow psychological warfare of waiting for an inevitable attack. Days passed. Then a week, then 2. Red Hollow went about its business with underlying tension, everyone aware that Cain was out there, everyone jumping at shadows. But life had to continue. Crops needed planting, cattle needed tending the store, and bank required attention. Alara threw herself back into work with fierce determination, as if staying busy could somehow ward off danger. Jonah admired her courage while worrying about her stubbornness. They were alike in too many ways, neither willing to back down even when wisdom suggested retreat. The attack, when it finally came, wasn't what Jonah had expected. It was a Tuesday evening in late May. Jonah and Alara were riding back from town, the sun just beginning its descent when smoke suddenly shied violently. Jonah's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but before he could draw it, a voice called out from the rocks to their left. "Easy now, old man. You draw that gun, and the girl dies before you clear leather." Cain stepped into view from behind a boulder, his pale eyes glinting in the fading light. He looked thinner than Jonah remembered, harder, like something that had been refined in fire until only the most essential and dangerous parts remained. He held a rifle trained on Alara with the casual competence of someone who'd shot hundreds of people over his murderous career. "Cain, Jonah said, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Figured you'd show eventually." "Did you?" Cain replied. "I'm flattered you remembered me. Though I suppose killing a man's companions and putting a bullet in his shoulder tends to leave an impression." "You came to my ranch with murder in mind," Jonah replied. "Got what you deserved." "Deserved," Cain repeated and laughed, that terrible empty sound Jonah remembered from the trial. "Interesting word. I've spent my whole life being told what I deserve. Punishment, damnation, death. But here I am still breathing, still free. Funny how that works. What do you want? Alara asked, her voice remarkably steady, given the circumstances. Want? Kane's attention shifted to her. I want to watch everything you both love burn to ash. I want to take from you what you took from me. I want... He paused, considering. Actually, I'm not sure what I want beyond general destruction. I used to think I killed for money, for causes, for reasons. But I've realized the truth. I kill because I can. Because it's the only thing I'm genuinely good at. That's not something to be proud of, Alara said. Pride? Kane shook his head. I'm not proud. I'm honest. Most people pretend they're good, pretend they're moral, pretend they wouldn't do terrible things given the right circumstances. I just skip the pretense. I am what I am, a killer, a monster, whatever label makes you comfortable. And now I'm here to do what monsters do. Jonah's mind raced, calculating angles and possibilities. Kane was roughly 20 feet away, good cover behind the rocks, clear shot at both of them. Drawing his rifle would get Alara killed. Not drawing it would get them both killed eventually. The math was simple and brutal. You're going to kill us either way, Jonah said. So why the conversation? Why not just shoot? Because I'm curious, Kane replied. You're not stupid, old man. You must have known I'd escape eventually, that I'd come for revenge. Yet, you stayed here, let the girl come back, made yourselves easy targets. Why? Pride, stubbornness, or something else? This is our home, Jonah said simply. Running would just mean dying somewhere else. At least here, we die for something we believe in. How noble, Kane said mockingly, and pointless. Nothing you've built will last. Red Hollow will forget you in a generation. The bank will probably fail or get bought out by someone worse than the Thorntons. The store will close when business shifts elsewhere. Everything you fought for will turn to dust eventually. All struggle is futile. All victories are temporary. Maybe, Alara spoke up. But that doesn't make them meaningless. We changed things while we could. We helped people who needed helping. We stood against corruption and won, even if it's temporary. That matters even if you can't see it. Kane studied her with something that might have been curiosity in a normal person, but looked more like a scientist examining an interesting insect. You really believe that? Even facing death, you believe your little moral victories mean something. They do, Alara said firmly. They mean everything. For a long moment, Kane didn't move. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of approaching night. Jonah could see the calculation in Kane's eyes, could almost hear the man weighing options and outcomes. Then Kane shifted his aim slightly to the left and fired. The bullet missed Alara by inches, kicking up dust behind her. Smoke reared, nearly throwing both riders, and Jonah used the moment of confusion to grab Alara and dive from the saddle, pulling her down behind a small outcropping of rocks as Kane fired again. Run! Jonah shouted, drawing his revolver and returning fire. He knew he couldn't hit Kane at this range with a pistol, but he could buy seconds. Get to the rocks behind us. Go. Alara didn't argue, scrambling backward as Jonah laid down covering fire. He emptied the revolver in 4 seconds, each shot carefully placed to keep Kane's head down, then followed Alara deeper into the rocks as bullets chased them. They found themselves in a natural formation that offered decent cover, not perfect, but better than being exposed in the open. Jonah quickly reloaded while Alara caught her breath, her face pale but composed. He's playing with us, she said. That first shot, he could have killed me easily. He's drawing this out. I know, Jonah said grimly. He's a sadist. Killing quickly doesn't satisfy him anymore. He wants us to suffer first. So, what do we do? Jonah considered their options. They were pinned down with limited ammunition, facing a superior marksman who had better position and no time constraints. The ranch was a mile away. Town was 3 miles. Help wasn't coming because no one knew they were in trouble. We adapt, Jonah said finally. It'll be dark in 30 minutes. That's our advantage. Kane's good, but he's not superhuman. In the dark, we have a chance to move to flank him, maybe get close enough for a clean shot. 30 minutes is a long time when someone's shooting at you, Alara pointed out. Then we make it difficult for him, Jonah replied. He picked up a rock and threw it to their right. Kane's rifle cracked immediately, the bullet striking where the rock had landed. "See," Jonah said. "He's jumpy, firing at movement without confirming targets. We can use that." Over the next 20 minutes, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse. They'd throw rocks, creating noise and movement to draw Kane's fire, then shift positions while he was reloading. Slowly, carefully, they worked their way through the rocks toward a position that would give them a better angle. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, plunging the desert into that brief twilight that preceded full darkness. Jonah knew they had maybe 10 minutes before the light failed completely. "When I move," he whispered to Alara, "you lay down covering fire. Don't try to hit him, just keep his head down." "I'm going to circle around, get behind his position." "That's suicide," Alara hissed. "It's the only play we have," Jonah replied. "Trust me." Before she could argue further, he was moving using the dimming light and the rocks for cover. He heard Alara open fire. Slow, measured shots that echoed across the desert. Kane returned fire, and Jonah used the sound to orient himself, moving parallel to Kane's position. His old body protested, the exertion joints complaining and lungs burning, but Jonah pushed through it. He'd done night movements during the war, stalking enemy sentries through far worse terrain. This was just muscle memory kicking in. He circled wide using the darkening sky for concealment and approached Kane's position from behind. The man was focused forward, rifle trained on where Alara was shooting from, completely unaware of Jonah's approach. Jonah took careful aim with his revolver. 30 feet not impossible, but not easy in failing light. He steadied his breathing, found his target, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took Kane high in the back, spinning him around. He tried to bring his rifle up, but Jonah fired again this time, catching him in the chest. Kane staggered, his pale eyes wide with something that might have been surprise, then dropped to his knees. Jonah approached carefully, revolver trained on the fallen man. Kane was still alive, blood bubbling from his lips but fading fast. Those ice-blue eyes found Jonah's, and even dying, they held no fear or regret, just that same terrible emptiness. "Told you," Kane gasped. "I'd come back." "You did," Jonah agreed. "And you lost. Again." "Didn't lose," Kane's voice was fading. "Just ended. Like everything ends. Like you'll end, like—" His eyes went distant, fixed on something only he could see. Then he was gone, that awful emptiness finally extinguished. Jonah stood over the body for a long moment, feeling nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, just tired. So tired. "Jonah," Alara appeared from the rocks, running toward him. Is he?" "He's dead," Jonah confirmed. "For real this time." Alara looked down at Kane's body, then back at Jonah. In the gathering darkness, he could see tears on her face. "It's really over, Ma," she asked. "All of it. The Thorntons. Kane, all the violence." "This part's over," Jonah said. "There'll always be more violence, more corrupt men, more fights worth fighting. But this particular war, yeah, it's done." They retrieved Smoke, who'd wandered only a short distance, and rode slowly back to the ranch. Neither spoke much, both processing what had happened, both too exhausted for words. By the time they reached the cabin, full darkness had fallen. Jonah built a fire while Alara made coffee, and they sat together in the flickering light, warming their hands on the cups. "I'm going back to San Francisco," Alara said finally. "Not forever, but for a while. I need us distance from all of this, from the violence and the memories and the weight of it all." "I understand," Jonah said, and he did. A few weeks. I want to make sure the store and bank are properly settled first. But then I need to go be young somewhere that isn't haunted by what happened here." "You'll come back, though," Jonah said. It wasn't quite a question. "I will," Alara promised. "This is home. Your family, Jonah. Not by blood, but by choice, which might be even stronger. I'll always come back." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the night pressing close around the cabin. Outside, the desert was vast and indifferent, but inside, in this small space, there was warmth and understanding, and something that felt remarkably like peace. The next morning, they took Kane's body to Sheriff Reeves, who arranged for it to be sent back to Denver for confirmation. The federal marshals would need to officially close the case process, the paperwork file, the reports that turned human tragedy into administrative records. Red Hollow. When it heard the news, reacted with quiet relief rather than celebration. Kane's death meant one less monster in the world, but it also meant the long shadow that had hung over the town since the Thorntons' reign finally dissipated. People could breathe easier walk without constantly looking over their shoulders, build, without wondering if it would all be torn down by corruption and violence. The cooperative bank continued to thrive. The store served its customers faithfully. New businesses opened, young families moved in, and Red Hollow slowly transformed from a town defined by its oppression into a community defined by its resilience. 3 weeks after Kane's death, Jonah accompanied Alara to the stagecoach one final time. She was heading back to San Francisco for 6 months this time, with plans to return the following spring. "You'll write?" Jonah asked. "Every week," Alara promised. "And you'll take care of yourself, actually eat proper meals and not just coffee and jerky." "I'll try," Jonah said, smiling. "Mrs. Henderson's already threatened to bring me dinner twice a week, whether I want it or not." "Good," Alara said. "She's terrifying enough that you might actually listen." The stagecoach driver called for boarding. Alara hugged Jonah tightly, and this time he didn't hold back, embracing her with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd nearly lost what they'd found. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, "for everything, for saving me, for believing in me, for showing me that good people still exist." "You did the same for me," Jonah replied. "Reminded me that life's worth living, that I still had something to contribute. So I'd say we're even." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'll be back before you know it, with stories about San Francisco and plans for Red Hollow and probably some crazy ideas about expanding the bank or opening another store." "I'll be here," Jonah assured her. "Right here, waiting to hear every word." The stagecoach pulled away, and Jonah watched it go with less pain than last time. This wasn't goodbye, it was just temporary. She'd come back. She'd always come back. And in the meantime, he had work to do, a community to serve, a life to live. He rode back to the ranch slowly, taking time to appreciate the desert's harsh beauty. The sun was high, the heat brutal, but Jonah found he didn't mind. This was his place. These were his people. This was the purpose he'd spent 20 years searching for without knowing it. That evening he stood on his porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Somewhere far away his sister Sarah rested in peace. Her memory no longer a source of crushing guilt, but rather a reminder of why standing up to evil mattered. His wife's grave was well tended, her legacy living on in the ranch she'd helped build. And Alara, his daughter, in all the ways that mattered, was out there making her own path, living the life he'd fought to preserve. Jonah Whitlock had spent most of his 63 years feeling like he'd failed the people he loved. But standing there in the fading light, watching Red Hollow's lights begin to twinkle in the distance, he finally understood something important. Redemption wasn't about fixing the past. It was about honoring it by building something better in the present. It was about choosing every day to stand for something good, even when standing was difficult. It was about helping when you could, fighting when you must, and believing that individual actions mattered, even in a world that often felt indifferent to suffering. He'd saved one girl, built one bank, helped one town find its way from under corruption's shadow. In the grand scheme of things, maybe that wasn't much, but it was enough. More than enough. As full darkness fell and the stars emerged in their countless millions, Jonah went inside and lit a lamp. He had letters to write, bank reports to review, plans to refine. Life continued ordinary and extraordinary, brutal and beautiful all at once. And for the first time since he could remember Jonah, Whitlock looked at that life and felt not just acceptance, but gratitude. He'd been given a second chance to get things right, and by God he'd taken it. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. And tomorrow Jonah would wake up and do it all again, not because he had to, but because he chose to. That choice he'd learned made all the difference.